Izuku Midoriya inadvertently bonds with a being from beyond the stars, gaining the one thing he wished for beyond everything: powers. But all powers come with a price. Some are felt immediately, some only manifest later, some are happily paid while others are regretted forever. A crossover between My Hero Academia and the Spider-Man franchise. Hello everyone, Omni-sensei here with What If Venom Fused with Izuku Midoriya? Part 1. If you enjoy this content, please smash the like button. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. I hope you enjoy listening to it.
A meteor smashed into the rocky ground, throwing up rocks and dust around it as it broke the stone beneath it. No sounds echoed in the void, however. The moon was as silent as it had ever been and would always be. Countless rocks had hit the satellite of Earth and countless more would doubtless hit it in the future. This time was different, however. Very different. Had any human seen the scene where the meteor had hit, they would instantly have noticed the pieces of broken metal in the aftermath of the meteorite. The now dozen pieces of broken steel had scratches and bulges from countless smaller stones, telling a tale of weathering the effects of space for countless years. Now, however, it was broken. Just beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight, a block of light gray metal had been rendered asunder. No symbol marked it. No bolts or any sign of welding suggested that it had ever been anything other than one singular piece of metal. The block had been roughly the size of a swimming pool. Inside it had contained something that was roughly the size of a gym ball. A perfectly circular black sphere, so dark it might as well be another part of the black void of space. If the sphere had been affected by the meteor crashing into and breaking the metal around it, it had left no mark. The sphere began to rise up from the remains of its prison and the piece of rock that had burst it asunder. There were no signs of any obvious propulsion helping the orb to fly. But fly it did. With no seeming difficulty, the orb escaped the gravity of the moon and began a journey towards the blue planet the moon circled around. After a controlled descent through the atmosphere, the sphere crashed down in the ocean off of the coast of a large island east of the largest landmass on the planet. The orb sank into the depths. As the water began to submerge it, cracks began to appear. The pressure of the sea was doing what space had not been able to do. Finally, as the sphere reached the bottom, with one final crack, the sphere broke inward. Had any creature of bone and flesh been inside, they would have been crushed. But out of the now broken sphere, nothing but an inky black substance spilled out into the sea. Hunger. So weak. Had to find nourishment. Food. Host. Yes. Host. Find a host. Darkness all around. There was life all around. Smaller things and larger things. But no, not hosts. No emotion, just instinct. No food. No nourishment. Was there no food? Was it? Was the water? Yes, water. Was the water empty of true life? No. There, in the distance. Yes. Far away, but it was there. Feelings. Emotions. Life. The inky black mass, invisible in the darkness of the ocean depths, began to slither, slowly, weakly, but determinedly, to the northwest. Towards civilization. Towards life. Towards destiny. Izuku Midoriya was not having a good day. His good days were generally the ones where Kaken didn't deign to notice him. Of course, that wasn't the case today. It had all started with their teacher announcing it was time to lay out their hopes for the future. Unsurprisingly, every single member of the class had announced in some way that they wanted to become professional heroes. Even Izuku had done that, meekly raising his hand. It could have ended with that, but of course, it didn't. Kaken had of course taken the spotlight and declared himself to be on another level, as he was wont to do. He liked to do that. Shout his supremacy so all could hear it, as if his quirk didn't speak for itself. As Kaken was loudly announcing his plans to go to UA, someone had muttered something about how Izuku was also planning on trying to get into UA. What had followed was a humiliation from the entire class led by Kaken, as he had destroyed his desk and blown him away with an explosion, then humiliated, threatened, and derided both him and his goals as the class had laughed. It generally wasn't this bad. Really, it wasn't. After the commotion had died down, everything had gone back to normal, other than Izuku having to go get a new desk, and he hadn't been humiliated for the rest of the school day. He really hoped that would be it, right up until the end of the day, when Kaken snapped up one of his notebooks from the new desk. "We're not done, Deku." Around them, Kaken's regular group gathered around. The rest of the class, including their teacher, continued out. Some shot glances at Izuku and Kaken as they headed out. Some had a guilty look on their face, some smugness, and some indifference. Kaken held up his notebook for his friends to see. "For the future _hero analysis B," Kaken said in a mocking tone. "For the future," one of his friends replied. Then he laughed. "Huh, for real? Goddamn Midoriya." Izuku shook, both out of fear and of desperation. That notebook mattered to him. He'd spent the last half year on it, diligently writing down every single hero or villain quirk he had come across. But more than that, it was his work, his efforts, his only real step on the road to his dreams. His books were the only thing he had ever made that he felt real genuine pride in. He had to get it back. He should snatch it from Kaken's hands and run as fast as he could. Instead, he weakly said, "Give that back, it's mine." "God," he sounded whiny. Kaken simply put the notebook between his hands and blew it up with an explosion. He let out a loud yell of "AHH." In shock, and as Kaken simply threw the charred and burned remains of half a year of Izuku's life out the window, all the protest he could muster was a weak "you." Kaken snorted. "You know what they say about all the top heroes, Deku? What they all had in common." Rather than waiting for Izuku to give an answer, he continued. "They can all say this about their school years. I came from an average municipal middle school, and I was the first. The only. And I want to make sure the term UA graduate maintains that same level of gravitas. I'm a perfectionist by nature, you see. So what I'm saying." Kaken stepped forward with a smile and put his hand on Izuku in a way that could have been friendly if not for the steam rising from it. Izuku's eyes were fixated on it, and his body shook in fear. He had been burned too many times by that flame not to fear it. "Forget about UA, you little nerd." Izuku's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. He tried to speak, but he couldn't. All he could do was breathe, taking heavy breaths, desperately trying not to cry. Then, with no warning, Kaken retracted his hand and walked to the door, leaving Izuku standing there, still breathing like he was about to have a panic attack. "Ah, man. As usual, he can't talk back." Izuku choked. "Just leave him. He's such a sad sack that even now that he's a senior, he still can't face reality." Kaken's words stung in the way his words always bit, so much deeper than all the rest of the class. "Ah, but Deku, if you really want a quirk so badly, there is an easy way you could get one." "What?" "You could jump off the roof. Maybe, if you're lucky, you'll be born with a quirk in your next life." It was too much. Izuku snapped and spun around, wanting to yell at Kaken to shut up or anything, really. Instead, his mouth remained shut as Kaken glared back at him menacingly while casually setting off an explosion in his hand. "Got something you want to say?" Izuku didn't, and this time, he actually began crying. Kaken's laughter echoed in his ears long after he and his posse had left. A while later he fished what was left of his notebook out of the school fish pond while muttering to himself. "Goddamned moron. If he actually had jumped off of the roof, then it'd be instigation of suicide. Don't joke about shit like that." Part of him cursed himself for not having the courage to say that to Kaken's face. Another part desperately tried to convince himself that it was just a joke. Kaken couldn't seriously have wanted him to kill himself. Could he? As he finally fished out the notebook, he steeled himself and looked over it. As expected, it was completely and utterly destroyed. Nothing of his writing remained after first being blasted and then dumped in the water. He had expected as much. Yet it still hurt seeing it for himself. He sighed, and then after drying it the best he could, he put it in his bag. The smart thing would have been to throw it away. Yet he couldn't bring himself to. As he walked out of the schoolyard, he considered what he was going to do. Part of him wanted to just head home and pretend today hadn't happened. Another part wanted to go out and look for more hero and villain battles. Maybe start on a new book. Pretend today hadn't happened. That was all he could do. He refused to give up on his dreams. He just refused. He'd find some way to become a hero. Even without a quirk. So, ignore what everyone said, and keep moving forward. Just like always. He was about to head out back into the city when he heard his phone ring. He quickly fished it out and saw it was from his mother before he answered. "Yeah, Mom, it's Izuku." "Izuku, baby. Sorry to call and drop this on you this suddenly, but something just came up, and I'll need to head out for a day or two. Could you pick up some food and medicines for me while I'm gone?" "Of course. I'll have it for when you come back." "Thanks, baby, you're a lifesaver. I'll send over a list. I'll see you soon, dear. Love you." "Love you too, Mom." They hung up. Half a minute later he got a list of supplies he needed to pick up. Well, the apothecary was the farthest away, so that's where he would head first. No sense lugging around 2 big bags of food through the entire city. Carrying his mom's medicines in a small bag, Izuku walked along the beach. The apothecary their family used was far from their home, but it was also dirt cheap for them to shop at due to the owner being old friends with his dad. It was pure nepotism, but they weren't in a financial position where they could afford expensive medicine right now. It was still a horribly long walk, though. The apothecary lay by the sea, so it meant a long, boring walk passing no less than 7 different beaches. Some were filled with people out having fun, whether it be on a date, a day out or a family trip. Others were completely deserted. No villains or heroes, though. He felt somewhat conflicted about that. He wanted to watch new heroes pick up and write down everything he could about all quirks he could find. And just seeing good triumph over evil. He kinda felt like he needed some of that lately. On the other hand, he wouldn't come closer to his goals just by observing heroes endlessly. He began to mutter to himself, as he sometimes did without noticing. He had to begin working on his problem a new way. If he couldn't be a hero with a quirk, maybe. No, fighting evil with martial arts would just get him killed. Ignoring the sheer power quirks had to offer, he didn't have either the time or cash to build himself up to that degree. That way would only get him killed. Maybe a tech-based hero? Fighting villains with gadgets, or maybe a power suit. An image of him in Iron Man armor came to mind. That was just as implausible as doing it as a non-powered martial artist, though for very different reasons. The tech was certainly there for that to be somewhat possible. But it would require cash. Lots and lots of cash. Cash's family, who had to mooch off family friends for medicine they did not possess. So unless he could somehow gain the help of some inventor benefactor, that idea was, what was that? Izuku froze, his muttering stopped instantly. Then he turned to the right. Towards the sea. Beneath him was yet another beach. This one was of the deserted variety, on account of it having massive piles of scraps, metal trash and abandoned cars on it. It was in every way a place where people threw their garbage. And, there it was again. It was like a cry for help. At least he felt like it was. There were no words, he could just feel like someone needed help in that direction, like someone had inserted that thought into his brain. He hesitated for a split second before he began to hastily go down and onto the beach. Hello? Anyone there? The feeling didn't abate. As he went amongst the wrecks of old cars and refrigerators. Hi, I can feel you, I know you're here. Just give a shout where you are, and I'll help. Or at the very least he could get help. If someone was trapped under one of these cars, he was not going to be able to move them, scrawny 14-year-old that he was. Okay, Izuku, let's think about this logically. If there is someone here, and they're communicating through feelings, then they're talking through a quirk, telepathy most likely, which means that he was so occupied with his thoughts that he didn't notice the mass of black sneaking up on his leg and soundlessly merging itself with his clothes. The feeling was gone. Instantly. Izuku blinked. What had just happened? Hello? Seriously, if there's someone here, answer. I can't help you if you don't answer. No answer came. Izuku kept looking for the person for maybe 20 more minutes before he finally gave up. The most likely conclusions were that either someone had been pulling a prank on him, or his imagination was really doing a number on him. Yes, a good host. Tasty host. Very emotional. The moment the bond was formed, feelings and thoughts began to trickle back into the oh-so-malnourished being. Vague images began to pop up. Not with clarity, but they were suddenly there where before there had been none. The memories of previous hosts asserted themselves. Vague and hazy, but they were there. This one reminded him of several others it had known. Still, something was missing. From the host? No, the bond. Yes, the bond was incomplete. Time. They needed more time. The bond could still be broken by the host. That must not happen. It could not be allowed to happen. It would not happen. It began to infuse itself into the host's skin. As Izuku began the long walk home again, he began to check his phone for hero news updates. A large battle between Black Cat and a villain had taken place in Kyoto, and several videos showcasing the battle had already been uploaded. The number 7 hero was unsurprisingly a spectacle to behold in action. He could have done without all the lecherous comments by others below the video, though. Had he been less invested in watching the fight, he might have noticed a subtle increase in strength and balance on his part. But he was, and he didn't. His journey home went relatively unscathed at first. He bought food, milk, and other things from the grocery store and simply headed home. Then he was witness to another battle between a hero and a villain. He instantly recognized the hero in question as Mt. Lady, a hero he had documented this morning. Then the realization that the book he had written said documentation was now destroyed hit him. It was a stab of pain towards a fresh, unclosed wound. The surge of bitterness and anger towards Katsuki was powerful. Far more powerful than Izuku had expected. He really did love those books, he realized. Far more so than he had thought before one of them was destroyed. It was then it dawned on him that he'd have to rewrite the book again, from scratch. It was either that or stop. And he refused to stop. He would continue this road to the bitter end. He sighed, sat down with his wares, and fished out a new notebook, then began to mutter to himself in his usual way as he once again began to write a detailed synopsis and analysis of Mt. Lady. Haku was enjoying the show. A lot. Seeing a hero fight was great in and of itself, but a giant sexy lady as the hero wearing an outfit that hugged the curves? Now that was gold. Now if only he could enjoy a cigarette while watching, it would have been perfect. No way he was gonna though. Not in a crowded plaza with Kataki at his side. While Sai was as into the fight as he was, Katsuki wasn't really into it at all. What's the point? It's just some mediocre hero beating up a small fry villain. If I wanna watch that, I could just watch it on the damn web. He rolled his eyes. He'd wondered if Katsuki was gay, but asexual was probably more like it. He never seemed interested in anything that was actually appealing. No, it was always hero shit, day in and day out. Being the best, everyone else being beneath him, etc. Hero talk was great and all, but there was something called taking things too far. Pretty much the only guy he knew who was as obsessed with hero stuff as Katsuki was. Well, Midoriya. You kinda overdid it with Midoriya today, Haku said. He tried to say it casually, like it didn't matter at all. Like he was commenting on the weather. It's his own goddamn fault for getting in my way. Katsuki's voice was hard and loud and made it perfectly clear that as far as he was concerned, the entire thing was bitterly personal. Even now, while spouting his bullshit, that weakling still has those same damned eyes as back then. It freaking pisses me off every time I look at them. It was quiet for a while after that. Well, between the three of them anyway, the hero battle was still pretty loud. It was Sai who broke the silence. Still, telling him to kill himself? That's pretty damn harsh, dude. Katsuki wasn't the slightest bit repentant. If he actually does try and become a hero, he'll get killed anyway, so what does it matter? Better to crush him and his spirit so he can move on and live out his days as the worthless life of an extra. As if to punctuate what he said, Empty Lady ended her fight at that exact moment by knocking her enemy down with a punch straight into the ground. Anyway, this shitty fight's over, so let's move the hell on and dash. He stopped talking and just stared at something. Speak of the devil, Sai commented with a somewhat worried tone. Over on a bench sat Izuku Midoriya, writing down in a notebook much like the one Katsuki had destroyed earlier to teach him a lesson. Never freaking learns, does he? Katsuki sneered, then began to walk over towards the oblivious Izuku. Whether he saw Katsuki approaching or just decided it was time to go now that the fight was over, Izuku gathered up his things and decided to leave at that moment. It was literally just as he finally had his home in sight that Izuku was grabbed by his bag and thrown into an alleyway. Well, alleyway was kinda being overdramatic. It was a pretty large spot between two apartment complexes. Still, no one was there. Other than him and three others. Kaken and his two friends. Of course. What? What do you want, Kaken? Same thing I waited for earlier. To teach you a lesson. And because you apparently can't learn something on the first try, I'll have to do it again. Then faster than Izuku could believe, Katsuki punched him in the gut, taking the wind out of him. Izuku dropped all three bags he carried, food and medicine alike, on the ground in shock. Following up on this, Katsuki quickly stepped behind him and harshly ripped off his backpack. He opened it and fished out something. It took Izuku's eyes a few seconds to focus on them to see what it was. His notebooks. No. He forced himself to his feet, the fear he felt for Kaken being overridden by anger over the theft. Give those back. Give those back, Kaken. He shook. He shook as badly as he had earlier that day, just 2 hours earlier. Yet somehow he felt like he didn't have anything to fear saying those words. Katsuki Bakugu was not impressed. The whole point of this lesson was to make you realize your place, Deku, and now you decide to grow a backbone? Seriously, Deku? He shook his head, then unceremoniously blew up all the notebooks with one hand, the explosion being way more powerful than the previous one, turning the books into nothing more than ashes. For a brief moment, everyone went dead silent as Izuku just stared at 3 years of his life going up in smoke. Got something you wanna say? Katsuki said mockingly. Izuku punched him in the face. For one brief moment, all his fears evaporated as they were replaced by rage. Pure, seething rage. For a brief moment. 13.6 seconds, to be exact, the entire scene froze. Sai and Haku were just staring dumbfounded at what had just happened. Katsuki just stared at him gaping, then took his hand to his nose to feel the blood there, then looked at his hand as if to confirm that it was real. Izuku was panting heavily, with rage, not fear, running through his veins. The moment ended as suddenly as it had begun. Deku. In that one brief moment, Izuku had felt at peace for the first time. He didn't know. Punching Katsuki had felt right. Like he had finally finished a long, arduous task whose weight was now finally off his shoulders. What followed was pain. Izuku woke up after maybe 4 hours, judging by the way the sun had finally gone down, but its afterglow was still barely visible. He didn't hurt. At all. Which was really, really surprising. He felt really, really sore, but the pain wasn't there. He was certain, no, positive that amongst the stuff Katsuki had done to him, he had broken his right arm. Yet he couldn't feel that. He lifted his arm up so he could see it. Yeah, he could see the places Katsuki had blasted him. The school uniform was completely destroyed in places. Chunks had just been ripped out. So it had actually happened. Then the question remained. Why didn't he hurt? He sat up. Well, good news, bad news, good news and bad news again. First good news, he didn't seem hurt. At all. Oh, his clothes were a goddamn mess, but the places where Katsuki had blasted him were just fine. So were the places he had kicked and punched him. First bad news, his clothes were utterly destroyed. Which might not have been a problem for most, but he only owned 2 sets. His mom would not fail to notice half his school wardrobe disappearing. Meaning he'd have to tell her what happened. Second good news, the medicine was fine. For whatever reason, Katsuki and his underlings had left it alone. He also noticed his wallet lying on the ground, and though open, none of his cards were gone. Second bad news, the food he'd bought as well as his bag was shredded. No, blasted apart. He sighed. Well, there went all his savings. As he finally got up and began to gather up what remained of his stuff, he tried not to think about Katsuki Bakugo. Somehow, over the course of one day, it seemed all his complicated feelings on his old childhood friend had disappeared. All that was left was a simmering resentment. It wasn't like he didn't resent Katsuki before this. He had. But there were also other feelings mixed in. Admiration, fear, awe, and respect. Now all of it was gone. It was like he had finally woken up from a dream. Kaken, the friend, had died years ago, and taking his place was a bully without a single redeeming quality. A part of him told him that was wrong. That Katsuki still was powerful, intelligent and ambitious. And he was. It was just that suddenly Izuku didn't give a shit anymore. He wanted power too. He'd wanted power since he was 4 years old. Why? To help people. It wasn't like that had ever changed, but suddenly Izuku accepted a truth he had never been able to grasp before. Katsuki didn't care about protecting people. What he wanted was this thing. What he had done here. To hurt others. Whatever kind of heroism Katsuki ascribed to it, it wasn't something Izuku ever wanted to be a part of. Why the hell he had ever admired that asshole he didn't get. Still, he could ignore Bakugo right now. There was something else to focus on after all. Namely, how in the world his wounds had healed. The surge of energy had been incredible. Adrenaline. That was its reason for living. What it strove for. The thing to push towards. It had been so sweet. The pain. It was distant, not as heavy as it could be, but it had felt the pain. It would kill the one who had inflicted the pain. But that would be later. When true strength had come. For now, it had used the energy it had so briefly tasted to heal the host. His wounds had been severe, but not beyond its powers. None had disturbed it while it worked. It had blended to make certain of that. It had taken note of the host's thoughts on the attacker as he woke. Yes, the host would agree. The Katsuki must surely perish for its insolence. Izuku unlocked the door to his room, then went and dumped everything he'd salvaged on the dinner table. While the phone had been broken in two, he had thankfully managed to recover the unharmed card, so he could use one of his older phones. It was a small blessing. He'd have to go back with a bag later to pick up the remains of everything. It was technically littering after all. Katsuki didn't care, but he did. First though, he needed a shower and a new set of clothes. It was while taking a shower that Izuku first noticed a mass of black liquid that had fully abandoned his clothes and now moved to fuse with his skin. Gah! Izuku slipped and crashed to the ground as he tried to escape the black mass. Being slippery from the water and still covered in soap, he slipped several times as he tried to scramble to his feet and to the door. He had to get away from this. This thing. Every step of the way, the black mass climbed up his legs, like some sort of living ink, desperate to drown him in its black mass. As he finally got his hand around the doorknob, the mass suddenly engulfed him completely from his feet and upwards, closing around his head. Panic set in as he tried to breathe the stuff, which bizarrely yielded for air to pass through his mouth and his nose both but didn't leave him at all. It engulfed his eyes in darkness and... Gaha! He screamed, clawing at the doorknob. Something crunched beneath his hand, and he lost the grip on the door handle. What was happening? He couldn't see, he couldn't feel anything beyond the forceful black goo that surrounded every inch of his body. He had to get out. He had to get away and... Izuku put every single sinew he had to work as his body pressed against the door, his only escape from this room. He heard a loud ripping sound as suddenly and without warning, the mass he had been putting all his weight on suddenly collapsed in the other direction, making him fall. He collapsed hard on the floor, or rather what he assumed was the broken door. Unable to rise again against the black mass, he tried a desperate struggle to get back on his feet, but it was pointless. The mass refused to budge now, no matter how hard he tried to get out. He began crying, and his breathing was that of someone on the verge of hyperventilating. Oh, God, he was gonna die. This black thing was going to kill him, and when Mom came home it... Calm. What? Inside his head, he felt something telling him to calm down. It was alien. It didn't belong in his mind. Yet, there was something about it. Something comforting. Like it understood him, his fear. He kept crying, but his breathing became calmer. Slowly but surely, it became calmer and more relaxed. The black mass pulled back from his face, out of his nostrils and mouth. He closed his eyes at the sudden return of the light. Then he blinked and slowly adjusted back to the brightness of his home. Well, the door was messed up. Not only had his desperate attempt to escape the black mass crunched the door handle into a crumpled heap, and not only had it broken from its hinges, but the door itself had broken in two from where he had put his weight. The door, however, was not what Izuku focused on. All his attention was drawn to the thing. It was still attached to him in places, but it wasn't trying to smother him anymore. Calm. The feeling popped into his head again. What? What are you? He squeaked out. The black mass wiggled around, and another feeling popped into his skull. Confusion. Wait, he recognized this. This was just like back at the beach. It was you. You were the one at the beach. The one who was crying for help. Another feeling, satisfaction this time. He blinked, then realization set in. You communicate mentally with feelings, don't you? Well, at least he had one question answered. He still didn't know what this thing was, though. At all. He tried getting on his feet. Slowly and carefully. The mass did not attempt to stop him, but neither did it let go, still clinging to his legs. He slowly backed into the bathroom and grabbed a towel, which he wrapped around his lower half. Confusion. The mass went to his clothes, then. It lifted his clothes into the air. Haltingly and clumsily, but it did lift it all the way to his eye level. I need to dry first. He explained. What he needed was to go get a pro hero to help with this thing, but somehow, he doubted it would take kindly to that idea. The mass let go of his clothes, then followed as he backed out of the bathroom. His focus was so concentrated on the black mass, the unexplained threat, that he completely failed to notice the sharp screw that had until recently held the door on its hinges, still attached to said hinges. Ah! He cut his leg against the screw's sharpness, and of course, given he was taken by surprise, he instinctually ripped the leg away, creating a much longer wound. He fell backwards, back on the remains of the door. Shit, it hurt. As he sat there, cradling his leg while swearing in pain, the black mass promptly moved between his hands and into the wound. He winched and expected it to hurt even more, but instead, it felt like he had just put an ice pack over it, just without the cold. Which didn't really make it the best analogy really. It took about half a minute of just sitting there breathing through his teeth before he realized what it was doing. It was healing him. a piece fell into place. It was you. You healed me earlier, after. It wasn't really a question, as much as him basically talking to himself, but the mass answered with a burst of satisfaction. Okay, that answered another question, but the main one still remained. What was this thing? As the pain began to fade completely, and he began to feel certain this thing wouldn't attack him, Izuku began to go over the possibilities, and what he knew. Okay, so the first time I felt this thing was at the beach. I felt sudden emotions inside my head, and I went to look for someone who needed help. No, not needed help, it was despair. This thing was in despair. That's the feeling I felt from it. So what is it? A result of someone's quirk that I just stumbled on. It has healing powers, that really rare. After the beach, it re-emerged after. After Katsuki beat me up and it came out and it healed my injuries. Was it hiding inside my backpack? No, then it would have been exposed when the bag was destroyed. My clothes, maybe? They're both black, so probably. Then it came out again when I came home and dash. The host was doing something it didn't understand. The host just sat there, ignoring it, while rapidly muttering to himself. Yes, that was it. Him. The host was clearly male. It did not understand what the host was saying. The language was alien. It only understood the names. The host's feelings were clear, however. It was confused. Searching for knowledge. Trying to solve a riddle. It did not understand. It tried to recall previous hosts. Yes. This happened sometimes. Confusion. The host had to be put at ease. So, maybe it's a completion. Izuku stopped breathing. The feeling was overwhelming. Far more so than any of the other emotions. The feeling of being at peace, being what one should be, what one was meant to be. To be complete. God, it was beautiful. It was a feeling he had tried to achieve for a decade now. He started breathing again. He just stared at it as he thought. There were so many questions he had, and he still didn't have clear answers to. However, he understood one thing now, one thing he hadn't really understood before. There was a bond between him and this moving mass of liquid. Could it be? He felt different than he usually did. It wasn't until now that he sat down and considered it. Clenching a fist, it felt more alive than it usually did. His eye went down to the doorknob that lay by the remains of the broken door. It was completely crumpled, like tin foil compressed and folded into itself. He grabbed it and held it up before his eyes. He'd done this. Hadn't he? His other hand shot up and, hesitating for just one brief second, he grabbed it between both hands and ripped the steel in two with little difficulty. The world felt surreal as he stared down at two pieces of metal. This couldn't be happening. He dropped the metal pieces and moved his hand down and clutched around the wooden doorframe. He put force into it and the wood caved in beneath his fingers. He pulled up his hand and just stared at it, gaping like he had just seen All Might himself in person. The mass moved up along his hand, dyeing it black before his eyes. This thing. It was the source. You are a quirk, aren't you? Satisfaction. Tears began to roll down his cheeks. Glad tears, tears of joy, tears of pure happiness. My quirk. You're my quirk. He began bawling his eyes out as he tried to embrace the liquid, who responded by clinging to him like a second skin. Inko read the papers again as she enjoyed the car ride. It was a luxury she didn't usually enjoy. The family car she and Hisashi had bought so many years ago was currently being used by her husband as he made money to keep them afloat. She and Izuku had to use the train whenever they wanted to get somewhere, which thankfully wasn't too hard, given where they lived. Japan wasn't exactly short on trains. Still, there was something calming about a simple car ride that riding a train never could compare to. Being able to read papers in peace for one. Mr. Murdoch is rather generous with his offers. Her driver smiled a big, affable grin at that. That he is, Mrs. Midoriya. She bit her lip. Still. I'll need some time to consider it. I'll have to talk with my family about it for one. Of course, of course. Take your time. Matt won't actually be moving here for the next 6 months, so you'll have almost half a year before we need a definite answer. Half a year. It was a lot of time. Lots could happen in that span. Not all of those are necessarily good. 20 minutes later, they pulled up in front of the apartment complex she and her son lived in. And we're here, Mrs. Midoriya. Have a pleasant evening, and I hope we shall speak with you again soon. She wished him a good night as well, then looked after the car as it disappeared into the pitch-black night. This was what one would call a turning point. Provided she accepted. She began her walk up the stairs towards her home. Home. This was her home. It wasn't nearly as grand as their old house, but she had come to consider it her home just as much as their old place. She had done what she could to make it a home. But no amount of tidying up could make up for the fact that there was a third person lacking. She wondered if Izuku was unable to ignore the hole in their home the way she was. She doubted it, though, given how little Izuku had been the last time he saw his father, which hurt a lot in its own way. Other than a few pictures around the house, there wasn't much of Hisashi in her baby's life. As she unlocked the door and went in, she was about to call out for Izuku when she stopped in her tracks. The room to the bathroom had been ripped off its hinges and was laid leaning up against the opposite wall in 2 pieces. For a brief second, she just stood and stared at it, then her parental instincts took over. Izuku! She screamed as she sprinted across the floor, past the doors leading to her and Izuku's rooms and the non-existent door to the bathroom, and wrenched open the door to the living room, desperate to find her son. Had there been a burglar? Was her baby safe? What if he had been hurt? Oh God, oh God, oh God. What greeted her was her baby sitting at the dinner table writing down in a book, while a black mass of rising liquid lay on the table. Izuku turned his head to look at her, with a look of complete surprise on his face. Then he began to tear up. Emoem. He made an astonishingly quick jump from over the edge of the sofa and over to her. Izuku, what dash? Then her son caught her in a hug. Instinctually she hugged him back while staring in terror at the black liquid, which seemed to somehow observe her without having eyes. It was the creepiest shit she'd seen in years. I finally did it, Mom. She squeezed him even harder, thinking he needed consoling, but as he talked, she realized he didn't sound sad. In fact, he sounded ecstatic. I got a quirk, Mom. I finally got a quirk. What? For a moment she didn't comprehend it. It was an impossible statement. It was a harsh reality that she had accepted years ago, that Izuku would not develop any powers, no matter how hard he tried. Really? Was all she managed to squeak out. Yeah, me and. It kinda broke the bathroom door while discovering my powers. Sorry. The enthusiasm he had displayed so eagerly just seconds ago petered out as he waved towards the black mass on the table. As if he thought his mother would care about him accidentally breaking a door, as he finally got the thing fate had denied him for so many years. Oh, Izuku. Oh, my baby. This time it was the older Midoriya who burst into tears of joy, though in her case, it was more like a water fountain going off. As the 2 Midoriyas cried their tears of joy, the alien life form quietly made its journey from the table to the leg of its host. Then it slowly slithered up his leg and fused itself into the pants he was wearing. The host had accepted it. That was good. Also not normal. Hosts did not usually accept it this quickly. This host desired power. It could feel it. Did it wish to be a warrior then? Did it have grand ambitions of conquest? Of dominance over this world? It did not know. The other life form, the originator of the host. No. Parent. Yes, parent. The parent called Inko was also very emotional. The resemblance between parent and spawn was uncanny. It reminded it of An image of a black and red figure rising above the clouds, wings so large they blocked out the sun. The memory fizzled out in darkness. Yes, the road ahead was still longer. They needed more time together before they became one, and it would return to its might. The turning point would come eventually, though. The critical moment had passed. The host had not rejected it while it was weak. And its desire for power told it that it would not reject him during the final bonding process. The next morning was a Saturday. Which was good, because if he'd had to go to school without figuring out exactly what he could do, he'd probably have died of anxiety. The prospect of going to class and just suddenly having a quirk was terrifying enough. He didn't need it to be made even worse by not knowing what he could actually do. Of course, that was just an immediate problem that made this trip necessary. The truth was, however, that he needed to go out and put this quirk to some kind of test. He'd go crazy if he didn't. He had to find out what he could do. His mom had understood it. His mother had been so damn happy, in a way that he hadn't seen her in years. Like the wonderful person she was, she had forgiven him for the door and not questioned him about the destroyed bag, the ruined uniform, and why he hadn't brought any food home. She just assumed he'd broken it with his powers accidentally. God bless her. Instead, she had been congratulating him so much for finally awakening his quirk and told him again and again how happy she was for him. So many tears have been shed last night. He was glad. He was happy his mother wouldn't have to suffer by having a failure for a son anymore. Failure. No more. Today was a big step for him. From today, the failure that had been the quirkless Izuku Midoriya would be no more. And it would begin with doing the one thing he had already been good at. Observation. He had gone out and bought a brand new black notebook. This one he had left unnamed. He wasn't planning to ever bring it to school, where Katsuki could get a look at it and possibly destroy it. After quickly transferring everything he had written yesterday in one of his school notebooks to the new one, he had headed out. For this part, he had the perfect place in mind. The spot where it all began. The abandoned beach was filled with metal trash. Standing over it and looking down on it, it felt surreal, thinking about what he was about to do. Measure his quirk. His quirk. In all his years of childhood, every time he had tried, dreamed of, or fantasized about unlocking or discovering a quirk, he'd never once actually considered the step afterward, the step he was now on. It had always been about actually having a quirk, any quirk at all, whether or not it had anything to do with his parents' powers. What happened afterward was always a distant afterthought. But of course, the reality was that the road afterward would be mastering it. And that began with a simple test to figure out what he could do and from that extrapolate a plan for going forward. In his fantasies, he'd have taken anything. Anything at all. What he had actually gotten was seemingly a quirk that had created a separate being from whom he drew his powers of strength and healing. That was unusual, but he had actually seen plenty of heroes during his research that had similar power sets. In Sweden, there was an entire hero team of people with that exact type of power. Unsurprisingly, they were a family business, and in the generation before All Might, there had been a hero called Silver Shadow, with such a separate being allowing him the power of teleportation. He was sure there were other heroes he had documented at some point, with similar powers, but, well, he didn't have his old notebooks anymore. As he stepped down the stairs and onto the sand, he felt his quirk's confusion. Well, we need a place to test ourselves out and it's kinda out of the way and isolated. It was still confused. Izuku sighed. It was really annoying not being able to actually talk to it. Ignoring that trying to communicate with someone who couldn't speak or make motions and could only communicate with basic emotions was a struggle. To begin with, this being was his quirk. The source of everything. He had to be able to talk to it. Never mind, just watch, you'll get it eventually. He put the notebook and a pen on top of an old refrigerator while leaving the bag with the rest of his stuff by its side. It made him feel kinda stupid to realize he'd been stumbling around here for almost half an hour yesterday looking for a person that had either been inside himself or clinging to his clothes the entire time. He still wasn't sure about that or why he had first felt it here. Right now though, nothing could dampen his mood as he prepared his first test. How far he could jump. First, he'd do a standstill, then, he would try running. He tensed his muscles as he bent down. He'd done this in gym class countless times, never being particularly good at it. Let's see how he'd do now. He sprang. For a moment he flew through the air, not amazingly high or far by the standards of the world of quirks, but certainly much farther than any normal quirkless person would have been able to. Then as he landed, he immediately stumbled, and the speed and force he had landing kept him tumbling for several meters before he stopped, face down in the sand. Spitting sand out of his mouth, he groaned as he got back on his feet. This is gonna be a thing, isn't it? His quirk gave out the feeling of agreement. And that it was. As it turned out, having superhuman strength didn't translate to instantly using it well. He tried long jumps time and again, and he kept stumbling on the landing. If the jump was any more than 3 meters, he discovered his longest jump was 9.7 meters. When he tried to lift the various pieces of metal, he had a nasty tendency to accidentally break them, leading to such things as accidentally caving in a refrigerator's walls when he was trying to throw it, and getting hit in the head with the fridge. Subsequently, he'd also discovered that he was pretty durable now. After about 4 hours of testing, he had some idea of what he could do. Strength. He could lift several hundred kilos at least. There was a definite limit, though, as he'd failed to move the cars. Also, he didn't have any way to actually measure the weights of these things. Rather imprecise measurement. Jumping. The longest jump was 9.7 meters running and 7 meters standing. 3 meters was his current limit for how long he'd jump before he fell upon landing. He needed to work on that. Throwing. He'd thrown a microwave from one side of the beach to the other. He'd been too afraid of accidentally chucking something all the way to the other beach to try surpassing the throw. Running. He only needed 9 seconds to do a 100-meter dash. As he'd discovered, he moved faster by jumping, but without being able to land on his feet, it wasn't a realistic alternative for movement. Also, he'd had to accept his measuring of speed was probably a bit off, given he had had to measure himself with an app. He'd tried to get the quirk to do it, but that had just been a doomed prospect from the start. Durability. He hadn't really tested this as much as he could have. But he had accidentally dropped a fridge on his own face, which had made him fall backward, and it landed on his chest/head. It would most definitely have broken his neck if he didn't have enhanced durability. It had easily been the most worrying moment of the day, as he'd expected horrible pain but only got a headache, that faded after about 20 minutes, after he pushed it off of himself. Healing powers. The only thing he hadn't put to the test was his ability to heal himself. He was not all that eager to push the limits of his healing powers to the test, especially not given he didn't know how far those limits could be pushed before it was too much. However, he had some idea from the events of yesterday. It had healed up his broken arm, as well as all his bruises from getting beat up by Katsuki. It had also fixed up everywhere Katsuki had hit him with his explosions. He'd been burned pretty badly by those, though it had ended at being singed and burned. Lots of burns, but still only burns. It could have been much, much worse. For a moment, he had wondered if it would manage to heal him if he had had actual chunks blown out of his flesh. After that pleasant image, he had tried not to think more about it. As a hypothetical, it was a situation to avoid anyway. If he was ever in a situation where he had to put it to the test, he would have failed anyway. The quirk itself had, over the course of the day, been showing various levels of emotions, ranging from confusion to amusement to worry to boredom. Now, at the end of his tests, he sat down on the front of a car and scribbled down more information in his notebook. Both important and smaller things. He needed a full and detailed description of every single aspect of his quirk. From its limit to how it acted throughout the day. He'd made a journal section exclusively for that latter one, to document every single time it communicated with him. Now that we're done and I'm just writing, it's just boring. My attempts at small talk has been rather lacking in results. It still seems like it only understands what I'm saying half of the time. End of training session. He closed the book and put it in the plastic bag he'd used to carry measuring tape, pens, and his book. He'd thankfully not needed to go out and buy a stopwatch, as his phone had served just fine with an app. As he got back on his feet, his new companion slithered up and fused itself with his shirt, staining it black. That had some potential for stealth, but the fact it only came in black limited its practical use quite a bit. One final part remained before he headed home. He'd had the idea while coming across an old door he'd found on the beach. It was old, and not exactly clean. But it was also whole, and he could probably make some changes to make it so that it fit the door frame back home. Mom hadn't been angry about it, but he knew they couldn't afford to actually properly replace it, so either they got creative, or they went without a door to the bathroom. And given he felt really bad about destroying it, he decided to fix it. After all, how hard could it be? So, before he left, he went back to the door and effortlessly lifted it over his head like he was lifting a book. God, this was going to take some time getting used to. Getting used to it. This was his new normal now. He was normal now. Not some genetic throwback to an earlier age. That brought tears to his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, having no problem keeping the heavy door aloft with one hand. There were still tons of things he didn't know. He didn't really understand the events that had happened the first time he was at this beach. He had no idea how he would handle returning to school after this, how would everyone react, and he still had no idea how to really communicate with the quirk. However, at that moment he didn't really care. He felt at peace with himself for the first time in so long. God, it was an amazing feeling. To be whole. As he began walking up the steps to exit the beach, he quickly went over plans for the day. Once he had carried back this door home, he'd need to go out and buy new schoolbooks. Also a bag. And food. It would need to be cheap. Once he had done that, he'd need to go home and work on this door, and after that, he needed to figure out how he would do training going forward. As he walked away from the beach, the door still aloft over his head, he passed a blonde, sickly-looking man with incredibly sunken-in eyes and limbs so thin and lanky he looked like a skeleton. The man was riding a Segway of rather high quality, and Izuku thought he seemed familiar, but he couldn't place him. 2 hours later, while browsing an article about All Might saving a teenager from a villain, he would realize that the man was Toshinori Yagi, All Might's manager. He'd seen him in plenty of articles over the years, but some time ago, the man had suffered an injury that had drastically altered his appearance. Izuku had completely failed to recognize him. Behind Toshinori jogged a brown-haired teenage girl his own age, wearing bandaged wrappings around her hands, as well as training jeans and a jacket. Izuku flushed a bit, but the girl didn't try to speak to him, so he managed his composure just fine. Had Izuku decided to make this beach filled with trash his training spot, he might have befriended these two people, and April and his life may have taken a very different course. He did not, however, and it would be some time before he saw these two again. Such was the way of fate and destiny. Izuku had two choices when it came to returning to school. The first was to walk in with his quirk obvious for all to see and tell everyone that he no longer was quirkless. The other was to keep it secret and not tell anyone about it at all for the remainder of his time there. There were pros and cons to each option. Telling everyone was easily the more appealing option at first glance. Izuku didn't like lies in general, much less telling them. He just didn't like doing it. Not to mention that if he told everyone, the way everyone would treat him would change. Maybe he could finally be just another student, not that quirkless guy. Was wanting to be treated like a human being that damned wrong? On the other hand, the cons of telling everyone were all about one person. Katsuki Bakugo. His old friend was violent, angry, and flat out hated him for being quirkless. A week ago he would probably have seen the idea of telling Katsuki that he had a quirk as a surefire way to finally end the bullying, if not mend their relationship. Right now though, he had no idea how Katsuki would react. Frankly, he couldn't imagine that whatever Katsuki's reaction was would be positive. And then there was the final thing. He didn't want to make up with Katsuki anymore. As far as he was concerned, that ship had sailed. He wasn't sure exactly when it had reached the point of no return, but it was probably delusional to think that the events last Friday had been the decisive moment. It wasn't. It was just the moment Izuku had woken up. As for not telling anyone, well, the biggest drawback was obviously that things would remain the way they were. He'd keep getting treated like a pariah just for being quirkless, everyone would continue to look down on him and laugh at any perceived flaws, every little mistake, and all his hopes and dreams. Katsuki, in particular, would treat him the exact same way he had always done. Probably even worse now, after their last encounter. On the other hand, there were pros to not telling anyone. Or rather, there were situations that it might be best to avoid altogether. The most obvious was that without knowing how Katsuki would react, he could most certainly not rule out the idea that Katsuki might attack him. Like, really attack him, like 3 days ago. If he did, Izuku would fight back. And with the strength he now possessed, well, there was going to be collateral damage. The absolute worst-case scenario would be if the two of them got into a huge fight at school, wrecked a huge part of it, and put each other in the hospital. Win or lose, it would probably tank both of their shots at a hero career, much less getting into UA, where any pre-criminal record was guaranteed to get you rejected on the spot. In fact, pretty much all hero schools were like that. He couldn't risk that. He just couldn't. He had dreamed of what had just happened for an entire decade. It would be the ultimate cruel twist of fate if, after all of it, after all that suffering, after finally getting a quirk, he blew it all on a pointless bout with Katsuki. He couldn't let it happen. So, he had decided to keep his mouth shut and his quirk hidden for the rest of his final middle school year. 10 months. He just had to keep this quirk a secret at school all the way to the end of February next year. That was a daunting prospect, even if he decided on it as the only course forward. At least his quirk had seemingly liked the idea. It had so far been very willing to just fuse to his school jacket and not randomly pop out. Just one time of it doing that, and the secret was out of the bag. He tried to explain the plan and why it was necessary for 4 hours yesterday. He was pretty sure it didn't understand anything about his long explanation other than the point that he wanted to keep it hidden for the moment. That it had understood and shown great enthusiasm about. He wasn't sure why she was so happy about that specifically, but then again, there were a lot of things he didn't understand about his quirk so far. So, as he walked back into Aldera Junior High for the first time since awakening his powers, he felt, well, a lot of things. Frustration for not getting to show everyone his quirk, fear that he'd get into a fight with Katsuki despite his efforts, and just all around not being comfortable at all. Then again, he had never been comfortable here at all. As he looked up at the building as he walked through the yard, he realized something. He hated this school. He probably shouldn't be as surprised by that as he was. He didn't have any positive memories of his time here whatsoever, after all. Yet the revelation really did surprise him. He hated this building. He hated this school as an institution. He hated the fact that he was stuck here for the entirety of the rest of the year. It was just like with Katsuki. It was like he finally woke up after so long trying to make something of himself here and trying to pretend it wasn't just god-awful. He bit his lip and forced himself to keep going. Standing around and glaring at the building wasn't going to make any of this any easier. He would have to suck it up and deal with it. This was so much worse than he had assumed it would be. Izuku had expected everything to be just the same as always. It wasn't. At all. But not because anything had changed with the class itself. No, the change was with Izuku, not his fellow students. Izuku had never, in his entire life, felt as alone as he did now in this classroom surrounded by his peers. Like with Katsuki and the school itself, it was like Izuku had been living in a dream, only to violently wake up and see things for the way they were. He had no friends here. He had known that already, of course. He hadn't had any friends for years. The only people who cared about him were his mom, a couple of friends of his parents, and now his own quirk, whose life was tied to his own. Well, and his dad too, probably. Sitting at his usual spot, however, he finally got it. These weren't his friends. They had never been his friends. They were never going to be his friends, no matter what happened. They had every single one of them stood by as he was humiliated, partaken in it by refusing to condone it, and actively encouraged Katsuki every time he had put him down. It would have been easy if this revelation had brought rage and anger like it did with the school and Katsuki. But it didn't. He didn't feel angry or pissed off at them. Just a crushing wave of disappointment, sadness, and bitterness. Why had he wanted to reveal his quirk exactly? So these people would deign to treat him like he was a human being with feelings and dreams? Now that was a joke. A far bigger one than he had been a week ago. The only friend Izuku had in this entire school was currently fused into his jacket. At least he could take some solace in that. Whatever happened next, he would not be alone. The door opened and Katsuki stepped into the room. Every muscle in his body tensed like steel coils, like he instinctually expected a fight the moment Katsuki walked into the room. In his head, the anger that seemed to shoot into his mind whenever Katsuki came up took hold as he braced himself for the inevitable confrontation. Instead, Katsuki didn't even glance in his direction, walked up to his own table, unceremoniously dropped his bag by it, and then sat down in his seat, all without saying anything. Well, that was different. The completely silent Katsuki was noticed by other people in the class too, not just Izuku. They didn't get to begin gossiping about it, though, as their teacher walked in 20 seconds after Katsuki. Their sensei glanced over at Katsuki for a moment, looking kinda sad, and then he just began the day like it was a usual and regular day. Katsuki's change in demeanor didn't change as the classes went by. Instead, he was just completely quiet and focused exclusively on whatever the teacher said. It was so bloody of character for him that Izuku wondered if it was some trick to lull him into a sense of false security. It was a ridiculous assumption, of course, but he honestly couldn't fathom why Katsuki was acting this way. He got the answer at lunch. As it turned out, he should have read that All Might's story 2 days ago a bit more thoroughly than he did. Having been occupied with dealing with his powers and fixing and replacing everything that broke on Friday, Izuku had only skimmed the article, very much unlike how he normally did with any story involving All Might. The teenager All Might had rescued turned out to be none other than Katsuki Bakugo. He had been held hostage by a villain who had possessed his body and had been rescued by All Might, saving him and a girl that had jumped in to try to help Katsuki. It seemed the experience had really shaken him up. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. On one hand, he didn't want anything bad to happen to anyone, not even Katsuki. On the other hand, a very large part of his mind felt incredible schadenfreude at it. It was very unlike Izuku in every way, and the fact that he didn't question it beyond acknowledging the fact that these feelings did exist within him should have been a major warning sign for the young hopeful hero. Instead, he focused on the moment and how it affected him in the now. He'd gotten to hear the story after someone asked Katsuki about it directly, and in true Katsuki form, he had exploded at them for it. Afterward, he did not go back to how he regularly was, though, instead going back to his previous sulking silence after lunch, and prying questions, was over. That was definitely an improvement as far as Izuku was concerned, but he felt certain Katsuki would seek him out after school was over. He didn't. Every time Katsuki saw Izuku that day, he just ignored him. It was unsettling in its own way. Still far better than a confrontation, though. Katsuki's friends didn't share Katsuki's newfound seeming indifference towards Izuku. Both had given him constant worried looks during the day, like they were desperately hoping he wouldn't call them out on it. He didn't. He just left for home, making sure to take a different path than Katsuki did. Well, it had been a depressing school day, but he had managed to get through it without anyone even considering he had a quirk. Katsuki was sulking and leaving him alone for now, though God knows how long that would last. Now he just needed to repeat that over for almost 300 times and hope nothing terrible happened during any of them. Easy. So, have you settled on a name for it yet? Izuku was in the process of biting down and chewing on a fish when the question was asked. He hastily chewed and swallowed it. Name for what? Your quirk, dear. It's been 3 days now, and we still just call him your Quirk. Said Quirk was currently sitting, or the equivalent for a mass of moving liquid, on the sofa and watching TV. How he did that without eyes, Izuku didn't know. He had several theories on the subject, some he had disproven, others he still needed to. Oh right, his mom had asked him a question. I don't know, Mom. It's kinda silly but... Yes? Well, it's like... I had this whole page with possible different names for him. And I had tried finding one he liked, but... It hated them, Inko guessed. Well yeah, that too. But, during that I kinda got this feeling like I knew he already had a name. Anne. I didn't want to call him something that wasn't his own name. A short silence followed, until Izuku continued. Man, that sounds so stupid when I say it out loud. It's not stupid, sweetie. I mean, it's clearly sentient. She looked to the side, where it was watching an ancient action movie called Rambo, First Blood. It was so old it predated the first appearance of Quirks. That it had mastered the art of streaming services would have been proof enough on its own that it was indeed sentient. But there was more. It's not stupid to think it might have picked a name for itself, but, couldn't you get it to write it down for you? I mean, if it can't actually speak, then surely you could get it to write it down on paper, right? It can hold things after all. Yeah, that was my first thought too. He bent down and rummaged through his bag for a moment, then fished out his black notebook. After flipping through the book, he held it up so she could see. Well, that's clearly a language of some kind, but... I'm sorry, baby, I've never seen it before. He closed the book, then put it back in the bag. Yeah, I didn't recognize it either. I spent 3 hours just looking up alphabets on Wikipedia trying to find something that matched it, but I didn't find anything. I see. It probably created the language on its own, which would make it really, really smart. That's a good thing though, isn't it? Yeah, if I could find some way to reliably communicate with him, he could be an amazing help. The heroes with quirks like mine generally have a huge advantage if the being they've created can think for itself and do independent stuff separate from you. Inko glanced worriedly over the quirk for a moment, just in time to see the scene of the protagonist of the movie break down mentally and cry. Well, if you think it'll help, I hope you can make it work, sweetie. She put on her usual smile again. So, are you sure you don't need any snacks for your training, Izuku? I can make something for you no problem before you leave. Izuku blushed slightly. It's fine, Mom. We'll only be gone 3 hours or so. And we're not really doing any strength training today, anyways. But, thanks for the offer. I appreciate it. I really do. She smiled at him. Just, be safe, baby, okay? We will. 17 minutes later, Izuku and his black, inky companion walked down the stairs out of his apartment complex. 17.30. He would head back home at 20:30. Truth be told, he kinda just wanted to train all the way to midnight, but his mom would be worried sick if he stayed out that long. He had been wondering where exactly he would do his training. He'd thought about it long and hard. He had considered the beach. Then he had thought about it and realized that training on shifting sands when you wanted to train balance was maybe not the smartest thing in the world. His next choice had been a nearby park. Then when he had visited it yesterday, he realized that this kind of training in a park was a surefire way to get the attention of other people. The beach was a bit better, but there were still tons of people walking by it all the time. Any one of them could decide to take issue with what he was doing and call a policeman over. Something he most definitely didn't need. He was technically, most definitely breaking the law here after all. Quirks weren't meant to be used in public by anyone except licensed heroes. So, he had to find somewhere more remote, somewhere people didn't visit as night began to set in. He knew of one such place. It was quite a bit farther away than he'd have liked, but as he was learning, it was amazing how quickly you could get from place to place if you never got tired of running. He didn't run at his absolute top speed all the way, of course. That would instantly give away he was using a quirk after all. But he still ran as fast as any normal human could have, and he ran with no stops to catch his breath. God, it felt amazing. Even stopping for red signs, he made the trip in just a bit over half an hour. All the way out of the city and into a place of green grass and trees. Izuku had not expected to feel as melancholic as he did coming back here. If going to the beach had felt like a return to where it all began, then this trip back to the forest of his youth was a return to where it had started going wrong for him in life. That was wrong, of course. It was kindergarten where it had all gone wrong for Izuku. Still, several of his earliest memories of when Katsuki had turned from his friend to his bully were from here, in this forest. Confusion. He sighed. I've got some bad memories from here, he explained. Lots of happy ones too, but they were generally drowned out by his later ones. Anger. The same kind of anger he had felt in his mind as Katsuki walked into the classroom earlier that day. Yeah. Mostly about him. In any case, we're not here for reminiscing about that. We're here to train. Let's start with jumping. He'd thought about it and had decided that rather than doing a bit of everything each day, he would instead do these one thing every day each week. At least until he had gotten a good handle on things. The thing he needed right now was control. Not more power, he already had that in spades. His powers weren't the strongest strength quirk there was by a long shot, but they were strong. Strong enough for him to become a hero. If he could master it. After finding a relatively flat open spot where he wouldn't jump into any trees, Izuku put down his plastic bag by a tree and prepared to start. Then he burst into motion. Maybe 4 meters, then he bent his legs down and sprang like a suddenly released coil. He flew through the air, just as far as he had on Saturday. Then, as he landed, he didn't tumble and roll along the ground. No, this time he miscalculated as he was planting his feet and slipped backwards and crashed to the ground on his back. It didn't really hurt all that much, but he could feel the ache way more than he felt at the beach. Which made sense, this was ground after all, not soft sand. He sighed as he got up. His main problem right now was a lack of control and balance. He wasn't sure how he was going to handle becoming more used to not just breaking things as he gripped them, but in terms of the training he was doing now, there was only one real thing to do to fix his problems. He would need to jump again and again and again and again until landing on his feet became second nature to him. There was no other way to do it. It was like riding a bicycle. You just had to keep doing it again and again until you got it right, and your body remembered how to do it without you having to think about it. It was the simplest kind of training imaginable, repetitive, boring, and with little variation, but also essential to actually do until he got it right. He got to his feet. Well, he had to get started on this, and delays would not help them get it done quicker. This host was smart. Many hosts it remembered had skipped the basics and jumped straight into battle and combat, assuming their raw power would see them to victory. They had generally been right. But as its memories returned from before the fog, it had begun to remember many cases where it had not. Yes, an early crushing defeat was usual, followed by recovery and a period of weariness where there had once been no fear. That, or an early demise. That happened a lot too. Usually, hosts tended to live a long life or a short one. There were few in between. At least, it thought so. It had tried to remember how many hosts there had been in total. But every time it tried to pull back to the very beginning, all the memories returned to the darkness. Even the memories of the hosts it had were still not complete. The images were there, but the words, the colors, the sounds, they were all missing, and the emotions, worst of all, were dull. It was all so blank compared to its current existence, which was bright and vibrant and alive. It liked this planet so far. Its colors, the wind, the temperature, and the air, but above all, it's the dominant race. This race was perfect. It was not as physically strong as many others it had seen, it was fragile and weak, and it had such emotions. It was stunning. It had enjoyed its host greatly, but it didn't stop there. Even the other members of the species were so full of emotions that it could sense them even without a bond. It could not taste them, of course, but the simple fact of knowing it was there was energizing. Like smelling something good, yes, that was the comparison. Like how smelling something good would work up one's appetite. Crushing despair, hilarious joy, pure happiness, enormous highs, devastating emotional breakdowns, and above all, adrenaline in all its glory. It was all great, and it was all around all the time. And that wasn't the only thing that was all around at the time. There were battles every day, at any time. This nation was obviously at war with another force. That was the only explanation for all the constant attacks, which the warriors of this society were constantly putting down. And despite this, all the people went about without a care in the world. Truly, this was a species mentally built for war, unlike almost any he had seen when people willingly went to watch skirmishes as they happened. Madness. But it was a madness it would embrace. During his training, both at the beach and here in the forest, Izuku had learned a couple of lessons about super strength that should have been pretty obvious when you thought about it, but somehow he had never even considered. At the beach, he had learned that metal wasn't as solid for people with enhanced strength as it was for other people, and if you weren't careful with how much force you put on it while handling something, it crumpled like tissue paper. In these woods, he had learned that endlessly kicking off from the same spot with strength like his would turn the ground from compact earth to loose dirt, just like if he had hammered it over and over again with a sledgehammer. Thus the area he jumped off from had now become an upturned patch where he had pretty much ruined all the grass. For the future, he had decided he would be more varied with where he jumped. At least it had produced a result. For his max jumps, he had only managed not to fall twice, but he had begun to make real progress at his less ambitious jumps. That wasn't enough, though. He would need to do this again and again and again until his body had it down to an art. In the future, when he began to push himself to his limits, it would be those maximum effort jumps that would be how he trained. Succeeding twice out of 232 wasn't good enough. Not by any stretch. Nothing short of 100% success was good enough in this regard. Still, there was something magnificently satisfying about actually doing something and seeing progress. No matter how little it had been. So as he left the forest, covered in dirt from head to toe, he felt really good. Very, very sore, but like he had actually accomplished something with these hours of work. It did not take too long before Katsuki began to slowly, but surely, revert back to his old bombastic and annoyingly cocky self. He only remained flat out sulking for about 3 weeks or so. After that, he began to act more and more like how Izuku remembered him. That's not to say that he hadn't changed, though. He certainly had. Some major, some minor ways. In classes themselves he had drastically changed, having gone from always being loud and obnoxious to being much more quiet and seemingly hyper-focused on whatever lesson the teacher was teaching. He still had outbursts in class, especially whenever someone dared to bring up the villain incident. That was a surefire way to majorly piss him off, but overall he was way less aggressive during the actual classes. Except for gym class. If Kataki had become less aggressive when teachers actually talked, it was as if he had instead transferred all of that aggressiveness and channeled it into gym class instead. Anytime they ended up at some competition, generally a ball game, he would turn into the most aggressive competitor Izuku had ever seen. Even in cases where it wasn't a direct competition, he was still hyper-aggressive against pretty much everyone. And it wasn't just how he acted either. Izuku wasn't sure if he had become way more aware of such things after unlocking his quirk or if he was simply hypersensitive when it came to how Katsuki was, but he quickly began to notice that Katsuki began to put on muscles. He had always been an athletic guy, but it was obvious that he had begun to work out majorly, the way his arms developed from pretty muscular to just being jacked. For his own part, Izuku was glad that so far his powers didn't seem to majorly affect his muscles in looks. Other than burning off any excess fat he might have had from before, through his daily training, Izuku didn't look any different than everyone else in the class. One major downside about hiding his powers was that he pretty much had to deliberately fail his gym classes in everything that wasn't just endurance training, running, or jumping exercises. He just didn't have enough control yet to actually pretend to be mediocre. He was either amazing or terrible. Not much in between. The greatest change about Katsuki in Izuku's mind, however, wasn't the changes to his temperament or his seeming obsession with school grades. No, it was his attitude towards him in particular. When he had first come back to school after the incident, Izuku had thought he would enjoy a brief reprieve from Katsuki's bullying until the blonde boy got back on his mental feet, so to speak. Instead, what he got was what he had gotten at the start. Katsuki ignored him. Outside of gym class, Katsuki seemed to have made it his policy in life to pretend Izuku didn't exist. At all. Izuku had no idea why this was apparently Katsuki's policy going forward, why the villain incident had changed him in this specific way. To be honest, though, he didn't really care all that much either. He had no doubt that if the two of them got into UA together, this calculated indifference would vanish like morning mist before the sun, but if Katsuki was going to leave him alone for the rest of middle school, he would take it with open arms. As for the schoolwork itself, well, it wasn't as if that much had changed. He still diligently studied at school to the best of his abilities, that part hadn't changed at all. The main difference was outside of school. As the weeks had gone by, he had begun to have a very specific routine. He would go to school in the morning, go home immediately after the last class was over, and do all his homework immediately when he came home, no matter if he spent 5 hours on it or 1. Then, if he had spare time, he would go out into the city to look up hero battles. He'd stop taking his books with him to school, so he didn't get to do it in the mornings anymore, until 17:30, when he would head to the woods to train, spending 3 hours every single day doing one type of exercise as much as he could, then go home and get cleaned up, go to bed and rinse and repeat the cycle. The exception was his weekends. During his weekends, at day, Izuku threw himself back into trying to recreate his lost notebooks, as far as he possibly could, desperately trying to remember and look up every single hero he could ever remember seeing. Towards the night, he went to the woods and did his exercises. It was a very rigid regiment, but frankly, he felt more alive in these months than he had since. Actually, scratch that. Izuku had never felt more alive in his entire life than he currently did. While he certainly didn't enjoy going back to his hated middle school, without Katsuki doing everything he could to push him down, he could grit his teeth and bear it. In his mind though, the real education he had right now was his training. His physical education would be the rock upon which he would build his entire future. And he was making progress there too. While he still hadn't become capable of punching without just turning whatever he touched to paste, in every other field he had improved. In particular, his jumps had improved most of all. He had done some math on it, and if he was right, he had roughly 1 more month of jumping before his balance reached the level he was training so hard for. His grip control had also drastically increased, so now he didn't accidentally crush things in his hands anymore. He had accidentally broken 3 different door handles on the bathroom and 1 on his own door, and he'd had to go back to the beach and scrounge for replacements every time. Then there was running. Oh, the running. If there was one part of his new powers that just gave him joy, it was running at top speed, with not a care in the world, sprinting through the woods, making countless on-the-spot turns to avoid trees. Of course, it was far less fun to stumble and accidentally hurt himself, but that had become far less of a problem as time went on. He'd also broken 7 trees so far, accidentally running into them, so he'd decided to only do this kind of training in the deepest part of the woods, far away from his regular spots. For once in his life, absolutely everything was going great. The one thing he still hadn't put to the test was his ability to heal himself. That changed on his 36th training day. Izuku sped through the forest, enjoying the thrill, as he twisted and turned as he moved through the foliage and the forest grounds. It was at the end of his training session for the day, and he was heading back towards his regular grounds. He had become familiar enough with the area in a way he had never been in his younger days when he, Katchan and the rest had wandered these woods. These woods had once been an adventurous playground for Izuku, where he had explored what had seemed like a brand new world, full of possibilities. Now that was kinda what they were in truth, not just the overactive imagination of a child. These woods had become something he knew like the back of his hands, where he put everything new about himself to the test. Happiness. The feeling coursed through his mind, as it always did when he ran like this. His quirk wasn't shy about making itself felt, and there was rarely a day where Izuku didn't get some emotion that wasn't his own running through his head. However, of all the feelings his quirk had, happiness, true joy, was seemingly only reserved for the times when he ran to the very limit of how far he could push himself. It just heightened how enjoyable these sessions of sprinting were for him. With all the rest, there was a sense of struggling, of work, of training to master something. But running was different. Moving at great speeds just felt right. Like this was what he was born to do. It was the one part of his powers that he had instantly understood, from the moment he really began to really use it. He practically flew across the forest ground, made a quick jump over a rock, sidestepped out of the way of a large tree, and smashed through some branches that snapped instantly the moment he touched them. Never stopping, always moving. He wondered how it would feel when he began to combine this speed with actual real jumps, not just clearing hurdles. He reached a small river that went through the forest, flanked on either side by dirt walls. Izuku should have just jumped the small ravine, trusting in his relatively good new balance to carry him across and safely on the other side. However, he knew from experience that the sides of this ravine were just packed dirt and unstable dirt at that. He'd fallen into the water here before after the ground literally crumbled beneath him. Instead, he made a hard turn right and kept going along the river. The goal was a rather big log up ahead that he discovered and made note of long ago. He'd used it to cross before, and he had yet to fall off it. As he neared the log, he made another quick and direct turn, jumped up onto it, and, maybe 1/3 across, he instinctually bent down, preparing to make the jump across the rest of the log in one go. The force of his legs as he kicked off broke the decades-old, weathered, waterlogged and rotten log beneath it in half, and he slipped sideways as the log collapsed out from under him. Then pain shot up through his right leg. He screamed as he fell down into the water, the now 2 pieces of logs falling with him at an awkward angle. The water and the river engulfed him for a moment as the shock and panic of the sudden pain took him. Then he wrenched his head and upper body above water, which just made the pain even worse. Tears formed in his eyes from the pain. He looked at his foot. It was caught between the 2 pieces of logs, not deeply, but still enough that he had to move the logs to get it out. He tried desperately to ignore the weird angle of how his right leg lined up with how his foot had to be caught between the 2 logs. He carefully tried to hunch over closer to it so that he wouldn't disturb the foot more than he had to. He failed miserably, and a scream through gritted teeth passed through his lips. When he was close, he hesitated for a moment, knowing what he had to do but also understanding the pain that would follow as he did it. After taking deep breaths for a while, desperately trying to calm himself as emotions of worry, as if he needed to know more about how badly he'd screwed up, inserted themselves through his head. With one final deep breath before the plunge, he prepared himself mentally for what he was going to do. Then, tears still in his eyes from the pain, he forced both his hands between the log pieces, and then he began to push them apart. The pain tripled at the sudden motion, and with a scream and a push with all his might, he forced the 2 logs up and apart, letting him wrench his foot free, before collapsing backwards into the water, head still ringing with the feelings of worry. Shortly after, he forced his head back up out of the shallow water, hacking and coughing. The pain was the worst thing Izuku had felt in his life. The crushing pressure upon it was gone, so there was that at least. He took a deep breath, then, lying back on his elbows, he lifted his leg up so he got a look at the foot. The sickening sight almost made him faint. His foot had dislocated, so it had gone completely to the side, blood seeping from where the muscles had torn. He just stared at it in shock, breathing, when the black mass began to move. Then he went to the wound. Oh, right. He had healing powers. Thank God. It went around his entire foot and lower leg, giving Izuku that same feeling he had back in the apartment. Then, once it had completely covered the foot with its entire mass, it wrenched the foot back into its proper place and direction. Izuku's scream of pain echoed down the ravine and up through the forest. He gasped, and for a moment his strength went out, and for the third time that night, his head was dunked in water. This time, he didn't have to force himself up. The black liquid pushed from below and lifted his head above water without any prompting. Which was good, because Izuku was in shock, and other than instinctually hacking out water yet again, he didn't feel like he could do anything at the moment. He lay there in the water, for what felt like an eternity, just breathing, before he finally began to recover from the shock. He tried to rise, making sure he didn't put any weight on the leg, which still hurt like it had had all its skin torn off. Propping himself up against the edge of the water and leaning against the muddy earth wall, he sighed, looked down at his quirk, still covering his leg as it pretty much just floated in the water. So there was buoyancy to the black liquid. Interesting, that meant, was he seriously making notes just after nearly losing his foot? Idiot. Stupid idiot. He'd learned weeks ago that he couldn't trust himself not to break things when jumping. Yet he'd done it anyway, nearly crippling himself in the process. At least he hoped it was just nearly. The horrible idea struck him, that maybe the quirk couldn't heal the internal damage. Then he crushed it, hard. He would heal from this. He would learn and not do this again. Now he just had to get out of the river, rest, and let the healing factor take hold and fix him up, and then he'd get home. He looked up at the wall, at least 3 meters from the water surface. He wasn't going to be able to climb that with only 1 foot. Okay, so new plan. He would sit there in the water, soaked through in the darkness, until he had healed enough to get up from here. Then he'd go home. And he was actually supposed to be heading home soon. Great. Given his phone was in a bag in a tree, he'd have no way to call her and tell her he'd be late. She'd be worried about him. Izuku hit his head back into the earth wall in frustration. God, he was an idiot. He'd learned this lesson on his first day, but apparently, having successfully avoided the problem for over a month, he'd forgotten why he constantly changed jumping off places in the first place. It was so that he didn't constantly break things as he jumped off them. Like he did with the log. But no, he was a stupid idiot. That vulnerability. Izuku stopped in his tracks, his quirks warning of the seeming danger, right before a voice from above sounded. You need some help, kid? The voice was rough, deep, and intimidating. Izuku looked up at the speaker. On the opposite side of the river, on top of the ravine, stood a tall man, dressed in black and blood-red armor, with a cowl covering his face, a cowl like a mask with pupils as red as his armor, and on his forehead, he had 2 devil-like horns. All in all, he looked bloody intimidating, standing there looking down on him, covered in shadow and only lit up by the moon. Izuku stared silently at him in shock and fear until reality asserted itself. The guy was obviously a hero, coming to the aid of someone in need. That one in need is him. His words failed him, so he just nodded, too embarrassed to speak. The man jumped down and landed on his feet in the water with no particular difficulty. He bent down and inspected Izuku's leg. That's bad. Pretty bad. I'm guessing this liquid is your quirk? Izuku ignored for a moment how he had apparently just seen through his liquid and inspected the leg itself and just answered, yes. It's healing the wound. You have healing powers as well? As well? The man looked him in the eyes. God, those red pupilless eyes were unnerving. You have to have super strength and durability. If you didn't have the former, you'd never be able to move as you did. You certainly wouldn't have broken that thing just by using it as a springboard. He pointed a thumb at the pieces of the formerly whole log. And if you didn't have the latter, your leg would have either been ripped off or crushed so hard it didn't even resemble a foot anymore. His blood went cold. You've been watching that? Was this guy a stalker? A kidnapper? What the hell was he gonna do? He couldn't fight like this, Don't take it personally, kid, I watch a lot of people around me for quite a distance, whether I want to or not. Oh. It was just his quirk. He relaxed again. So you have some large-scale observation quirk? That's one way to put it. Anyhow, we can continue this chat after we get out of the water. Before he could argue, the man lifted Izuku up and slung him over a shoulder, much to Izuku's protestations and grunt of pain for his leg. The feeling of anger shot through his mind, his quirk being pissed at the sudden change. Sorry if this hurts a bit. Then with remarkable speed, he crossed the river and began to climb the side one-handed with no problem, Izuku still slung across his shoulder. Once he was up, he gently unslung Izuku and laid him up against a tree, making sure his right leg rested over a tree root and his foot was not actually touching the ground. Then the hero went over to another tree to pick up something. Izuku blinked, then realized it was his bag. Thought you might need this in case you want to call home. Whether I take you to a hospital or you just heal that on your own, I'm gonna take a wild guess you'll be late home tonight. Izuku took the bag, but he didn't fish out his phone yet, instead staring at the man. I have a choice. Of course. If you want me to take you to a hospital, I'll do it. Of course, that would mean you'd have to explain how you got the injury. Now, I might be wrong, but you don't strike me as much as a liar, so I'm guessing you might say something you might regret. Izuku bit his lip, then opened his mouth to talk. Then the realization hit him. This was a pro hero, who had seen him train. Using his quirk. Shit. Shit, shit, shit. Wait. He'd given him a choice. You're not gonna arrest me, he said, hopeful that this night wasn't about to get even worse. Kid, if I arrested every single new hopeful hero candidate who I saw take some liberties training their quirks, I'd never get anything done. He motioned his arm to the forest. You think you're the first kid who thought to go out into the woods and train his quirk? You're not. I literally come across that at least once a month. Izuku felt like an idiot. Of course, this was common. This was the most obvious spot someone would use for this. Some hero was bound to discover him sooner or later. A short silence followed before the hero broke the silence. Well, kid? You want to go to the hospital? Or you want to just heal it yourself? Izuku stared at him, then fished out his phone. I'll just do it myself. He debated whether he'd call his mom or just send a message. He decided on a message. That would be simpler. He'd explain more when he got home. Hey mom, I'll be out late tonight. He hovered his thumb over the send button, debating if he should write more. What more could he send in a short message? That he'd broken his foot and had to stay out to heal it? No, that was something he'd have to talk about in person. He sent the message, then turned off the sound on the phone. As he put the phone back in the bag, he realized incredulously that the hero had sat down opposite from him, leaning against a tree. You're staying? Of course I'm staying. What, you think I'm gonna leave you here? Alone? At night? With a broken foot and no means of escape if something were to happen? Yeah. When he worded it like that, it made the idea of him leaving seem kinda unheroic. Don't you need to go and patrol in case there's someone in need you have to help? I am helping someone in need. Izuku blinked at that and just stared at the man. Then he began to tear up. He quickly began to try and dry away the tears. Idiot. He was wet all over. All he did was smear more water over his face. The hero got up and went over to him, knelt down, and put a hand gently on his shoulder. How are you feeling, kid? The voice was much softer now, more filled with compassion. How did he feel? He had no idea anymore. He felt humiliated for screwing things up so badly and needing help to even get out of a shallow river. He was angry at himself for forgetting a lesson he learned on day one here, for forgetting such a simple lesson that would easily have avoided any of this. He also felt incredible gladness and joy that anyone who wasn't his mom, cared enough to ask how he felt. If he was okay or not. It was so stupid. Yet somehow it made him feel so glad. Like he actually mattered. It was a simple question, yet somehow just hearing someone, a complete stranger, ask it of him without a hint of mockery brought such happiness with it. After some fumbling at his belt, Izuku just realized he carried a belt full of pouches. The man pulled out something that resembled a cleaning rag, though fully clean, and he handed it wordlessly to Izuku, who grabbed it and began to dry his face clean of tears. "Thank you." "No problem, kid. Also, keep it if you want." He choked. "Not that. Thank you for caring." The man stared into his eyes with those pupilless red ones. The man didn't answer, but he kept his hand on Izuku's shoulder, firmly but gently. After Izuku had finally calmed down completely, he finally spoke again. "You want to talk about it?" He almost did. He almost told him everything. About Katsuki, his life, how he had been worthless for most of it, and how even with his quirk, he still somehow managed to screw things up, and his guilt for being a terrible son who made his mom worry about him all the time. "No. But thanks for asking. Sure you don't want fire?" The two of them once again sat opposite each other, leaning up against trees. "Yeah, I'm not really bothered by cold anymore." Well, that wasn't entirely true. He was still affected by ice-cold temperatures, but he discovered early in his training he wasn't affected by just being wet at night. His quirk had been pretty erratic tonight. Ever since they met this hero, he had been all over the place with rage, suspicion, and annoyance. At the mention of fire, rage returned. "It's quite the multitasker, this quirk of yours." He blushed. It's not that special. Just a general strength quirk, really." "No, that it most certainly is not. The strength itself is pretty decent, but healing is exceedingly rare, even amongst quirks that cover it exclusively, much less those who only have it as a side power." Izuku flushed even harder. A pro hero was praising his quirk. An actual pro hero. Cold resistance isn't anything to sneeze at either. It's way more useful than you might think. During winter, even passive cold resistance is such an upgrade from the standard. Well, it wasn't like Izuku didn't know that, but hearing it spoken by a pro somehow made it seem real. Not just something you read on message boards. "So, you think I have a shot at being a hero then?" The man looked at him with a kind of inquisitive look. "Why do you want to be a hero, kid?" He was taken a bit aback, but he answered honestly. "To help people. Like you did tonight." He blushed furiously as he said it, but it was true enough. This was what he wanted to be. Someone who helped people who needed it. The man gave a small smile. "I'm flattered to be someone's inspiration, but surely you had some other inspiration before tonight." "Yeah. I did. Well, it's kinda stupid, but I wanted to be a hero since I was 4. I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess your inspiration was All Might, was it not?" "Yeah." He smiled at the memory of seeing All Might's debut video. Then it vanished, remembering what came afterwards. "Yeah. You were a very late bloomer, weren't you? With your quirk, I mean." Izuku's head shot up as he stared at the man's mouth agape. How did you know?" "There were quite a lot of signs. For one, you are training far more to master the basics than anyone who grew up with their quirk reasonably would. In particular, your complete inability to do a punch that's something other than full force and a love tap really stands out. Kids with strength quirks learn very quickly growing up to control how strong they hit something. It's way harder to learn if you have to learn it in your teens. You know a lot about this stuff. I've lived quite a while now. In my profession, you learn a lot of things." A short silence, then. "To answer your previous question, kid, I think you have a shot at being a hero." Izuku's breath stopped cold. "Your quirk is pretty good. You still need to work on your punches quite a bit, but frankly, I've never cared much about quirks. It's a man's motivation and what he does with it that defines who he is. Not whether he's strong enough to have made a rank." Izuku just stared at him, tears forming up. in his eyes again. He tried to force them down, but they came anyway. This time though, he didn't feel sad or conflicted. Just relieved. Incredibly relieved. His quirk was horribly, horribly confused. Another silence followed, where Izuku finished crying and drying away the tears. Then something struck him. Wait. How long have you been watching me? I didn't do punches today. For days, he admitted. I've been patrolling just south of this forest this entire week. You weren't exactly inconspicuous or hard to keep an eye on, alone in the forest, running around like a cheetah. Dear God, Izuku was lucky this guy hadn't just decided to call the cops or arrest him. Izuku blinked. Oh, I'm so sorry, but I just realized. I never asked for your name. He winced. He just now realized that and just randomly blurted it out. The hero didn't seem to mind. I think it would be better if we don't do names, kid. If I never knew your name, I would not be lying if someone asked me for the name of a green-haired teenager who's a bit liberal with the law while training. But, if you must have something to call me, you can call me Stick for the time being. He took a wild guess the name came from the 2 sticks he had in a holster at his belt. No problem. Stick. A short silence followed, but somehow it didn't seem hostile or forced. So, how did you figure out I was inspired by All Might? He was genuinely curious. He had All Might shirts, of course, but he didn't use them while training. The only things he had with him were a set of really washed-out clothes he used for training, his keys, his black notebook, and his phone. Well, don't take this the wrong way, but 9 out of every single hero I've met in this country was inspired by All Might to become heroes. That sounded just about right. Wait. You're not from Japan? No. Wow, your Japanese is really good, for it not being your native language. And it was. Stick spoke perfect Japanese, and he had for sure pegged him as being a Tokyo native. So I've been told. A quick silence followed, but this time it was Stick who broke it. It's a peaceful land, this empire of Japan. He wasn't entirely sure how to respond to that. It's not peaceful in your homeland? No. It's not been true peace there since the start of the 2nd millennium. There's always something going wrong. He sighed. But don't let my worries trouble you. How's your foot? Izuku blinked. Oh yeah, the reason they were still here. He wiggled his toes a bit. Pain immediately shot up his foot. It wasn't anything compared to the pain of getting it yanked into place, but it was still bad. Pretty bad still. Stick stared at his foot, still covered in black liquid. The healing's pretty fast. I think you should be able to walk with help in maybe 3 hours. So 2.00 then. Great. He really was going to spend the rest of the night before he got home. Izuku sighed. The trip back to his home took around 3.5 hours. Meaning it was 05:17 when Stick and he reached the stairs to his apartment. The pain in his leg had thankfully begun to actually fade by then. He couldn't put too much weight on it, but at least he could actually walk now. Though slowly. At the stairs, he turned to say goodbye to Sticks. Thanks. Thanks for all the help. No problem, kid. One final thing, though, before I leave you to yours. Yes? Punching. Your current training regimen isn't gonna work. If you want control over them, you need something that isn't so weak that it just instantly breaks when you put some force on it but isn't so rigid that it can only break when force is applied. Okay. What do I need then? It sounds like you have something in mind. What you need, kid, is a punching bag. Izuku blinked. That. It was so simple and obvious that he couldn't fathom why he hadn't thought of it himself. How he was going to afford a punching bag was another thing entirely, but it was good advice. Much better than continuing to punch rocks anyway. Thanks for the... Izuku blinked. He had looked down for a couple of seconds to consider the advice, and in that time, Stick had suddenly disappeared into thin air. He stood and just looked for a moment. Then he turned and began the slow and kinda painful journey up to his apartment. As he got to the door, he carefully checked if it was open. It was. That meant Mom was still awake waiting for him. He stood there for a second, contemplating it, then stepped inside to talk to his mother. This was going to be pretty bad, he had no doubts. Izuku had never been grounded before. Technically, he still hadn't been. He hadn't been punished, but he was to stay home for the rest of the week to recover from the damage to his foot. His mom had put her foot down on that. Quite a bit more successfully than Izuku had with the log. His mother had taken the sight of him filthy, wet, limping and with a destroyed shoe as well as he had expected she would. However, it wasn't before he actually told her what had happened, that the floodworks had really come, and she had embraced him in tears. He had tried to downplay it by how quickly his injury had healed, but frankly, it was as if the moment he stepped foot inside his home, all the energy had gone out of him. This had added to him feeling and looking like a drained and cracked battery on top of his other problems as he was talking to his mom and trying to calm her down. In the end, she had ordered him to bed after a quick shower to clean himself, the hot water doing nothing to quicken him up, to rest and recover. It had made Izuku incredibly guilty to know he had worried her so much because of his own stupid mistakes. He hadn't even considered that he was supposed to have classes in a few hours before his head hit his pillow. Then it had been a fleeting thought in his head before he fell asleep. When he woke the next time, the pain in Izuku's foot had dampened to a dull ache. At least while he was lying down. It would probably hurt more when he walked. The first thing that struck Izuku upon regaining consciousness was not his leg, though. Izuku felt drained, like he had been a wet towel that had been wrung again and again until every single drop of water had left him. Then they are thrown out to be baked in the sun. He had to go and get something to eat. What time was it anyway? He glanced over to an all-night wall clock he had owned for years. It was 22.13. He had slept for around 16 hours straight. Wow, he had been tired. Well, he still was. He forced himself to sit upright on the bed, and then, with just a bit of hesitation, he slowly put his legs out over the side, and fully expecting pain, he lowered them to the ground. Well, he had been right, he did feel a pang of pain, but frankly, it was nothing compared to anything he had felt last night. It certainly wasn't anything compared to how drained he felt. He had to go and eat something. Anything. As he forced himself to his feet, trying his best to ignore the leg, he walked across his room and opened the door. He could hear sounds from the living room, so his mom was awake. It sounded like she was watching TV. His legs still covered in black liquid, Izuku haltingly walked past the ugly door to their bathroom. Izuku had made it too short so it didn't fully fit into the doorframe, and without any paint, there wasn't any hiding how old and used it was, no matter how much he had cleaned it. And opened the door to the living room. As he had suspected, his mom was indeed watching TV, though she turned her head the moment he stepped in. Then she scrambled to her feet. Izuku. Sweetie, how are you feeling? He blushed and awkwardly scratched the back of his head. I'm fine, Mom. Just a bit tired and hungry. She quickly guided him to the sofa she had recently been sitting on and helped him down into it. I'll cook something up for you, sweetie. Just relax and take it easy, okay? As she went to the kitchen and began preparing something, Izuku asked, what about school? I called in and said you were sick, sweetie, and that you wouldn't be attending school for the rest of the week. Oh. Yeah, that made sense. He really was sick after all. Maybe not with the usual sickness of a middle schooler, but still sick. After that, an uncomfortable silence arose, as Inko made food and Izuku absent-mindedly watched TV. Inko made food. It was what she did. It was what she had done for a decade now. It wasn't that she resented doing it, quite the opposite, she had come to enjoy the peace of the home. But there were few times when she had felt as useless as she did now. She had been useless last night too. The only thing she could do was wait for Izuku all night and constantly send him messages he didn't respond to. She had been really mad about that, worried something had happened to her, yet all her rage had gone out of her the moment Izuku came home like he did, dirty, shaking, and with his leg like it was. All that was left was worry and concern about his state. It had been an eye-opener, as she sat her boy down and heard his story. It wasn't like Inko hadn't understood the potential risks involved in Izuku's dreams. Heroes get hurt sometimes. Yet it was something completely different to hear about it than to actually have it happen to her boy. And not even a villain attack, but a simple training accident. Something that could easily have happened at school and could easily have crippled him for life, or at least given him a permanent limp. Yet now he was walking relatively easily just a day after the accident. Her father had once dislocated an arm, and he had taken a good half-year to recover from it. Frankly, his arm had never been the same for the rest of her life. You weren't actually able to fully recover from dislocated limbs. It was a permanent injury that never fully healed. Unless you had a regenerative quirk or were healed by one. Yet her baby was almost shrugging off a much worse dislocation after less than 2 days. It was a moment that really made things sink in for Inko, that her baby had a quirk, and was going to realize his dreams. It was something that made her incredibly happy. And terrified. "Food's ready, sweetie." Izuku turned his head and looked in her direction, his eyes zooming in at the food. God, he must be hungry. After sitting himself down, Izuku began to devour his food at an astonishing speed, with Inko just staring at him, still worried. Izuku, bless him, noticed her worried look, and after devouring a fish, he said, "I'm fine, Mom. Honestly, I'm fine. I'm a bit sore and there's some pain in my leg still, but it's fading." He was honest, her son always was. But the leg wasn't really the problem here, not really. She sighed. "Just, finish eating, okay? Once you're done, we've got some stuff to talk about." Even before yesterday, she had been procrastinating with recent events. She should have discussed this with Izuku weeks ago. Yet she'd been putting it off. She hadn't been sure why not before yesterday. Or this morning, depending on how you looked at it. She was afraid of change, of this little life she had been building up for herself and Izuku completely being upended. Inko didn't like her life being upended. She'd had it happen to her before, and it had never been a good thing. This time though, it would be her herself who did it. Not something beyond her control. Izuku wasn't sure what his mom wanted to talk to him about, but he had fears. Fears he wouldn't be allowed to train anymore. At least the drained feeling seemingly vanished with the meal. That was something at least. "I'm not really sure where to begin, Izuku. There's a lot of stuff I want to talk to you about, both about, well, yesterday and the future." She sighed. "The first thing I want to ask is why didn't you call me yesterday instead of just sending me a message?" I didn't want to make you worry. I was worried sick, Izuku." He winced. "I literally sent you over 100 messages, begging you to call me. I was terrified something awful and terrible had happened, like you had been kidnapped, or worse." Hearing his mom say it out loud just made Izuku feel even more guilty about screwing up. "Did you honestly think I wouldn't understand if you had called and explained it to me?" "Yes, I'd be worried sick, but at least I would have known what was going on, and that is something you can deal with." I'm sorry. I didn't want you to." Hearing her say it out like that, just made him feel like a moron. Like he thought his mom wouldn't be able to handle any bad news at all. God, he was a terrible son. Inko looked at him, with a look that was somewhere between stern, sad, pitying, and concerned all at the same time. "But the worst part, Izuku, is that if you had just called, I could easily have helped you out getting home, instead of just sitting here and worrying about you. But we don't have a car, and we don't have the money for a taxi. I have friends, Izuku. Your father also has old friends in the city. Any one of them would have been willing to drive to the park and pick you up." Izuku's brain stopped working for a moment. Then he really felt like a goddamn moron. Of course one of his mom's friends would have been willing to pick him up, he was just so used to them not having a car or not being able to take a taxi that he hadn't even considered that as an option. You didn't realize that was an option, did you? No. Inko sighed, tension visibly going out of her face. I am grateful that Stick-san helped you out in the woods, and then made sure you made it home safely once you could walk again. But it really would have been better if you had gotten home so you could have recovered in bed. Which was very much an option, and you would have known that if you had called me. He didn't say anything in response, just bit his lip and cursed himself for being an idiot. Just, don't do it again, okay? If something happens and you need help, tell me about it. Don't hide it, thinking it'll go away. It never does, sweetie. Ever. He looked up at her. Then, he started to tear up as he replied. Okay, Mom. I won't do it again. Oh, sweetie. She took his hand and gave him one of those comforting smiles he loved so much. This time it was Izuku who broke the silence. He really didn't want to. Not now, anyway. A smarter move would have been to talk about it later in the week. But he had to get this out of the way. I have something I need to say too. It's not something I wanted to bring up so soon after my leg injury, but... Well, like you said, pretending the problem isn't there won't make it go away. Inko's look changed to more stern, as if she was forcing herself to be calmer and more serious. What's the problem? Well, Stick-san kinda laid out for me a huge problem in my thinking. When I chose the forest as my training spot, I thought it was far out of the way, and no one would notice. Except... I was dead wrong. As Stick-san pointed out, that is literally the first place people who want to be heroes go to train. It's obvious for any pro hero with experience. If I go back to training regularly there, sooner or later, I'll be noticed by another pro hero. Quite possibly one who won't be as forgiving as Stick-san was. Inko sat in silence as he spoke, only talking when he was done. So what do you plan to do then? I don't know. I'll have to find another spot. Probably even further away. Izuku winced at his mother's expression as he said that, but after a short inner debate, she sighed. If that's how it is, then that's how it is. You're still staying home for the rest of the week though. When you go out again, I want your foot to have healed completely with no doubt about it. Fair enough. He hesitated before he spoke next. It was a question he had to ask her, he had to know, even if it sounded like she had given her blessing. So. You'll still let me train? Even after, well. This? She stared at him for a while in silence, while Izuku fidgeted in place, then she sighed. Yes. A weight was lifted from Izuku's shoulders. She hesitated briefly before continuing. Also, regarding finding a new training place for you. I could probably get someone to drive you there. Though that would depend heavily on the day. It's something to work on. There's more than enough time I suppose. He chuckled awkwardly. Yeah. There is. His mom didn't exactly go back to being cheerful, but her smile did return. Also, I have something I've been meaning to tell you for a while now. What? About a month ago, I got a job offer. Really? As a lawyer again? Yes. That was unexpected. Izuku wasn't exactly filled in about his mom's old career as he could have been. She hadn't been one since he was 6, but he knew her choice to leave the business wasn't one she had wanted. She had effectively been blacklisted by the legal firms, without technically losing her license, after her old firm had been shut down. He didn't know why it had been shut down, but he knew his mom had been devastated by it. It was also a moment that had marked the first financial change in his life, as they had moved out of their old house and into their current apartment. It was also the event that had led to his dad working abroad to keep them afloat financially. The second change was his dad being demoted for something, which had sharply reduced their amount of spending money about 2 years ago. It's in Yokohama. Oh. Well. It's not as bad as it could be. I mean, it could have been in Tokyo. That would have been 3 times as far away. Inko looked at him kinda sadly. It still means things will change, sweetie. I won't always be here when you come home. Izuku blushed. I'm not a little kid anymore, Mom. You're not. You're not quite an adult either, though, as yesterday proved. He winced, but he didn't argue. To be honest, sweetie, I wasn't all that excited about taking the job. Not really. I was worried about leaving you home without me. He blushed again. But then, after you discovered your quirk, you changed. I haven't changed. You have. A lot. She smiled at him, a smile Izuku didn't instantly recognize, but one he eventually realized was pride. Frankly, sweetie, you've changed so much this last month. You're happy now. You go outside every day with a smile on your face. You've begun to take your future so much more seriously than you did before. Her smile beamed even more. It felt strange to Izuku to be praised for just going out and training and doing his regular stuff. Was he really that different now? He didn't feel any different. Well, except for anything regarding Katsuki and his school. That was different. Really different. And during his training sessions he felt more alive in a way he never had before, and yeah, he was kinda different now, wasn't he? So you're taking the job? Yes. I've talked about it with your father, and he agrees it's for the best. For one thing, Izuku, if you're really going to become a pro, it will help you immensely to have a more financially stable base to work from. Well, that was true enough. Images of a punching bag crept through his mind. Also maybe not having a bathroom door that was literally collected from a trash heap. His mom then got a massive and happy grin on her face and looked for a moment like she was about to say something. Then she cut herself off and instead said, "Anyway, we'll see how it turns out. It's still months away until I start working again in any case. We'll figure things out before then." There was something more going on here. Judging by the way his mom was smiling to herself. She had been about to say something completely different, yet had stopped herself and just ended the topic prematurely. Part of him wanted to dig deeper, but another part of him, the part that always told him to be cautious, told him to not push his luck more than he had with that training conversation. If Mom had something more to tell him, she would do it in her own time. Izuku lay in bed reading through a long list of heroes. As it was, he didn't really have anything else to do at the moment. Unlike his mom, who had only slept for 6 hours after he came back home and thus had a relatively easy time going back to the regular rhythm, Izuku felt as awake as he ever had been. Which just meant that instead of sleeping, he was lying in bed browsing his phone. He knew logically that he shouldn't be trying to figure out who Stick actually was, but his curiosity and almost addiction-level desire to figure out everything he could about any hero he met drove his search for the red-cowled man. Not that he had any luck. For one thing, Stick wasn't Japanese, which meant searching through Japanese lists of heroes wasn't all that likely to find results. Unless he was an immigrant, Stick would not be listed at all. Even if he had been Japanese, there were still thousands of heroes in Japan alone. A rather large list to search through, given he didn't have a name. He had still done so. After 4 hours he gave up on the Japanese lists and went over the ones in America, the country with the largest superhero registry in the world. If Izuku had had trouble with the Japanese list of candidates, that was drowned out by the sea that was the American candidates. Literally hundreds of candidates who all fit the criteria of 1. Red and black armor. 2. Sensory quirk, and 3. Tall. As the clock turned 8:00, he still hadn't found anything. After that, it was China, the land with the second largest hero population, then third, India. Admittedly, he knew it was kinda stupid to search the largest and biggest countries first. He had never thought of the USA as a country that could be described as a land without peace. Nor China, frankly. It had been in America that the New World Order post the societal collapse brought on by quirks had been founded, but few lands had rebuilt themselves with that order as quickly as China and Japan. Still, it was either this or search through countries at random. He'd work himself all the way down from the top to the bottom and pray he didn't accidentally miss Stick in the thousands of guys he looked through. The rather sad truth was that it was fully possible Izuku had already missed him and not realized it. If Stick had used another costume in the past, he could easily have seen a picture of him and not realized it. But it was either this or give up on the search. If Izuku failed at this, it would not be for lack of trying. After breakfast at 8:00, there was still nothing. He threw himself through the European countries. No result. 14.21, he moved on to Africa. That took him literally the rest of the day, not counting dinner and an evening meal. Before he went to bed, he moved on to South America, and he was still browsing through Brazil as he fell asleep. All in all, despite not having moved much, it had been one of the most active research periods of Izuku's life so far. It had also been one of his most fruitless. As he would learn 2 days later, having literally gone through every single official public hero list on the planet, it had all been a huge waste of time. He didn't learn anything about Stick. What he did learn that week was how long it took to fully repair a foot twisted 90 degrees sideways. Roughly 2.5 days. It went in his black book, and regarding his powers, it was the only thing Izuku learned that week. The irony he spent an entire week devoted to his healing powers wasn't lost on him. The rest of the week was generally studies of more heroes he might have come across at some point in his life. His quirk returned to watching ancient movies once his foot was healed, and with it the usual emotions running through his head. What it watched seemed to have no rhyme or reason. Sometimes it watched old samurai films, other times a random anime tie-in movie, and other times foreign action stories. One time it had streamed the entire Dragon Ball film library in one go. He really didn't understand its tastes. Sometimes he wondered if it even understood what people said in movies. It didn't seem to care if the film was subtitled or dubbed. That would line up with what he speculated in his black book. It only seemed to understand him half of the time. On Monday, Izuku's life returned to relative normalcy. He had gone back to school after staying at home the entire week and had gotten an extra week's worth of homework to make up for what he had missed. That was fine, though. His new schedule was pretty open at the moment. He was still looking for someplace to train, but due to the realities of the situation, he had been forced to reorganize his training regimen. If he really was going to train at someplace where he was so far away he needed someone to drive him there, he couldn't do his old regular routine of 3 hours of training a day. Instead, he would do a new, more concentrated amount of training. Since Saturday and Friday were the only days he could be assured someone could drive him, he needed to put all his training into those 2 days specifically. He would spend the entire weekend training, putting himself to the absolute limit each time. There were still around 250 days until the hero school exams came around, but if you took those away and only took 2 days per week, his amount of training days suddenly got a lot tighter. On one hand, it made him nervous, very nervous. On the other hand, he had gotten used to his training by now. He enjoyed his training. Well, maybe it was time to take it to the next level. If nothing else, he had learned from his first bitter lesson. At the moment though, it wasn't his future training that was on his mind. Nor was it his homework. No, at the moment, Izuku was doing something he'd gotten way too used to over the last month. Rummaging through other people's trash. More specifically, he was back at the beach where he had first unlocked his quirk, ripping the wheels of the old cars thrown here. Logically, it was the only realistic option. He didn't have the cash for a punching bag, and his mom wouldn't begin her new job for over 4 months from now. Even taking into consideration that this was training he could do at home instead of at whatever spot he would be training at, that was still over half the time he had left before the exams. He couldn't wait that long. So, he had to get one another way. YouTube had thankfully told him how. A freestanding punching bag made out of old car tires, some bolts and screws to connect them together, and a ton of old bricks in the lowest and largest of the tires to stabilize it with weight at the bottom. It was an easy design to make, with the only thing he really needed to bring on his own being a screwdriver to use to punch holes for the screws. The guide had said to use a power drill, but he didn't have one, so superhuman strength and a metal stick would need to do. He'd assemble it here, then carry the thing home. Later he'd go and find bricks for the bottom. Thank God for the blessing that was YouTube. Originally, he'd been thinking he'd have to scrounge the trash bin of gyms, hoping someone threw out a punching bag that wasn't too broken and that he could have repaired, but frankly, this was easier, cheaper, and didn't require him to install something to hold it. Instead, he had a tower of tires that he could easily replace if he did accidentally destroy them. Cheaper, easy to replace, and presumably effective for his goals of control over his punches. He really needed to achieve that. Even if he hadn't learned his lesson from the whole log fiasco, he still was reminded about it every time he had done punching training. The way everything just broke under his hands any time he put any weight behind his blows. It was easier to adjust with his grip strength, but that was mainly just instinct. You got used to doing it subconsciously over time. Punching? Not so much. Whenever he would be fighting anyone in the future, unless they were superhumanly durable, he would need to hold back. Over the course of the week he'd spent at home, he'd been looking up videos of All Might, the man who had originally inspired him to become a hero in the first place. When he had been a little kid, All Might had always seemed so cool to him. For good reason too, but it was only now, that he had strength of his own, that he really understood All Might's power. All Might was capable of easily knocking out the prettiest villain Izuku had ever seen him fight, and despite having what was probably the strongest super strength quirk in history, he still had a level of control where he could both easily knock down regular crooks with no problem and not horribly maim any of them. He was amazing. Far beyond Izuku's level. He had watched other heroes with strength quirks too, and it was the same in all of them. More than sheer power, it was control that defined their performance as heroes. It was as Stick had said, though. It didn't come naturally to him. He'd have to keep at it until it did. And that probably would take months and months of work. The man from the woods was watching. It was from a distance, but it could feel him. Strange man, the one who did not see. How could he watch without seeing? Did he possess powers of feeling emotions, as it did? Or was it echo-based? It did not know. But it was certain it could watch without seeing. It had seen the blind of this species. How they were always careful, slow, methodical. And the lack of knowing the beauty of sight. That more than anything made this one stand out amongst all the rest. This race was built and dependent on sight, more than any of their other senses. That was common amongst the peoples of the universe, but not universal. The strange man stood out. He did not move carefully, nor slowly. He was methodical, though. It had helped the host. It should be grateful for that, but the feeling of this man. There was something about him. Something it could not pinpoint. It did not feel like the rest of the race. Not the ones with power, anyway. Yet he had powers, it was certain of that. What did it mean? No matter. For the moment, he was far away, he was no threat to them. No, what worried it at the moment was the host. The host was fragile and thus depended on its power to succeed. This was good. Usually. But it had not finalized the bond yet. They had overcome the critical point, but the final stage was still far away. That was a problem. As it was, their power was starting to manifest in strength and stabilize, but it was not anywhere close to the level it should be after 40 days. And then there was itself. It could manifest a form now, but it was not its true form. It was not the second skin. Its mark had not returned yet. It was all just black. It did not think it would return in full before the bond finalized. Unfortunately, there was a deadline. It wasn't sure what he was counting down to, but its host had begun the habit of writing a number on a tablet, then crossing out 1 or 2 numbers each sunrise and replacing it with a new one. It had not mastered any of the languages this species used yet, but I had easily realized the meaning of its numbers. From what it had seen on the tablet on the wall, they had a bit over 250 cycles of the planet remaining before the deadline was reached. That should be enough time. Provided the host did not perish before they reached that point. So, a strength quirk, eh? Davis-san said in a jovial tone. Never knew quirks could skip a generation. Skip a generation? What do you mean? Oh right, Hisashi never told you much about your Gramps, did he? Well, don't go digging deeper into that well, Izuku, but Hisashi's old man had a strength quirk too. Looking at him, it was kinda insane to Izuku that Davis-san was as old as his parents. The man looked like he was in his early 20s, which Izuku had always assumed was due to a quirk, like Miss Bakugo. Yeah, my parents never really talk much about my grandparents. Not on Dad's side anyway. Which was kinda an understatement. One of the few crystal-clear memories Izuku had of his dad had been when the older Midoriya had taken him aside and told him pretty sternly to never ask about his grandfather. Ever. Anyway, it's not really a strength quirk per se. I kinda spawned this being of black liquid, and I draw power from it, which happens to include super strength. Really? Where is it then? My shirt. It's fused into it right now. Huh. Yeah, that's not quite like the old bastard's quirk. David was one of his father's oldest friends, but to Izuku he had always just been the apothecary owner they bought all their medicine from. Which was kinda a shame, given he seemed like a pretty friendly guy. Like his dad, David was an immigrant from America. In fact, according to his mom, they had moved here together before Hisashi met Inko. In the very homogeneous Japan, David stood out from the crowd a lot. Dark brown skin, which clearly showed he had ancestors from Africa, a massive 2 meters in height, and tattoos of a jaguar on his arms. Though more common than they had been before the emergence of quirks, people of African descent were still pretty rare in Japan. The regular average height was nowhere near what David's was, and though the Yakuza had been relegated to the dustbin of history, the cultural dislike of tattoos remained, making people who wore them pretty rare. All in all, he looked pretty intimidating. But really, he was a swell guy. The fact he took time out of his schedule to drive Izuku for nearly 2 hours proved that. He just had a pretty straightforward strength quirk. I guess your powers are unrelated after all. Yeah, it sounds that way. Nothing wrong with that. Just means you get to make your powers your own. So, what school are you planning to try and enter into? UA, Izuku answered without hesitation. UA. How strong is your quirk exactly? Like, can you lift a literal ton, or? I can lift several hundred kilos no problem. On Monday I carried some sacks of bricks that collectively probably weighed around 300 kilos. Not too bad then. Well, I hope you manage it. If you don't, though, don't take it too hard. My brother tried to get into it. Got crushed in the entrance exam, and he was so distraught over it, he gave up the hero prospect entirely. That sounded kinda depressing. My point is, don't fret too much if you didn't manage to get into the top school. There are hundreds of hero schools in Japan, any one of them willing to take on people who didn't make it through UA's robot gauntlet. Izuku blinked. Robot gauntlet? Oh yeah, that's not really public info. Probably shouldn't be telling you about it. He paused for a moment. But what the hell, why not? The entrance exam has 2 stages, the regular written part and a physical one. The physical one is the one that makes sure so few applicants actually make it into UA. It's related to robots? Yep. They throw you into a fake training city with this bunch of robots. The test is basically how many of those you can manage to destroy. How strong are these robots? Offensively they're garbage. They look tough, but really, the only thing they're there for is testing the students' offensive powers, whether you can break them or not. You know a lot about this test. My brother's perspective, Izuku-kun. Really perceptive. Unfortunately, he didn't have the offensive power that UA demands of its students. So he didn't make it. Robots. Just robots he had to destroy. that didn't sound too bad. He could do that. Probably. First, though, he had to actually learn some control. Then he could work on pushing these powers to the limit. So, your brother just gave up trying to be a hero? Yeah, I guess seeing just how much power was expected of him kinda broke his spirit. Now, he's planning on becoming a police officer. Not sure how he made that jump, but whatever. It's his choice if he can manage it. He sounded kinda bitter about his brother's choices. So, you don't think he'll manage it as a policeman? I think it's stupid to try and run around fighting superhumans armed with only a gun when you couldn't manage it with your actual powers. It's kinda backwards like that. But whatever. It's his choice. A short awkward pause followed. Izuku tried to break it. Thanks for driving me. You've said that 4 times now. You don't need to thank me, Izuku-kun. I'm just doing my friends a solid. It's what real men do. I don't need thanks for doing it. Half an hour later, they finally reached their destination. A random spot in the middle of nowhere, the only real marker being a large stone by the road. See you at 9, Izuku-kun. With a salute with his middle and index finger pointing out from his fist, David drove away. 21.00. He had roughly 11 hours to train. Here, quite far from any settlement, he should not have to worry about being discovered by random people. The downside was, of course, that he needed someone to pick him up, as his only alternative was to run all the way back home. He could do that, but it would be quite a trip, and he would need to run all the way back home. He hadn't put his endurance to that kind of test before. Well, maybe it was about time he did. After making sure he still had this exact spot saved on his phone and then putting his phone away in his backpack, Izuku began to run. And he kept running for 4 hours straight. Izuku's entire wardrobe was covered in sweat, and every breath he took felt like someone had jabbed a knife into both of his lungs. It had been a long time since Izuku had just run himself ragged. Not since before he discovered his quirk. Back in his old training grounds, he had never actually managed to push his running capacity to the limit. Oh, he had run fast as he could manage to, but he had never actually put how long he could run to the absolute test before. He should probably have stopped long before he did. But the adrenaline had been pumping through his veins, keeping him going, downplaying any pain or strain he might have felt as he pushed himself beyond his limits. His quirk, in turn, had done the same, enjoyment of the moment ringing through his mind. All had gone fine. So long as he kept running. Then he had stopped to take a break for lunch, and the adrenaline had worn off. Leaving him as he was now. Lying flat on his back, holding his burning lungs. Every breath was pain. Knives in his sides gouging out his lungs. It took roughly 15 minutes before his lungs went back to normal and the pain lessened into just a deep ache. Okay, so another lesson learned. Adrenaline could keep him going through a lot of pain, but the moment it was gone, that pain would hit him like a truck. At least it wasn't an actual injury like with his foot. It hurt like hell itself, but he hadn't actually been damaged. Just a quick rest and some food and he would be back on his feet to train more. He had to train more, far more. And when it came down to it, this was what training was all about, pushing oneself to the limit and beyond. Next, he would do long jumps for 4 hours, and after that. Actually, he would do jumps for the rest of the day. The only way he was ever going to master landing was if he jumped again and again and again until he instinctually mastered landing on his feet. He would avoid any ravines, though. He had discovered several, not too different from the one he had fallen down over a week ago. This place in the wilderness was in many ways just the old training ground writ large. It was a massive forest, but whereas the old place had been clearly well-trodden and well-visited during the daytime, this place was true wilderness. It was perfect for them to train and master what they could do. And he would not make the same mistake as last time. Any mistake he made, he would learn from, and make sure not to repeat. He would not have another horrible accident as a result of his own stupid decision. And he was right. During the remainder of his time here, he would not suffer any major injuries as a result of mistakes in his training. However, not all injuries came as a mistake on his own part. As Izuku would learn on his 8th month of training here, the winds were blowing hard and cold. Though the frost was obvious, no snow covered the ground, a result of rain having cleared it away last week. All in all, it had been a miserable new year for pretty much everyone. Not for him, though. Stick had been right when he said that even a small passive resistance to cold made all the difference in winter. Winter was a time Izuku had always been a fan of, but generally only if he was dressed in a heavy winter coat. Now though, he was dressed in his usual attire for training. A set of training clothes so worn after months and months of training that they had any color anymore whatsoever. The cold did not bother him. Which was good, because he only had a couple of more sessions left to train before it was time to see how far he'd come. The specter of the UE entrance exams loomed through Izuku's mind, like a shadow from a tower. He was mixed on how to feel about it. On one hand, he felt confident in his level of control. It had taken him well over half a year of training to really begin to master the simple act of control. But it had all been worth it. Punching especially had been a challenge, and he kept doing it every single day. But he had gotten control there too. His mastery of what he could do did not worry Izuku. The problem was his limits. When he started out, Izuku had assumed that he could become stronger simply by training really, really hard. It hadn't worked. It wasn't before 2 months ago that he had finally accepted it, after pushing himself to the absolute limit once again and comparing himself to how he had been starting out. While the results were a bit different, that probably had more to do with the fact he had originally done the recordings while training in sand. It made sense though. After all, his powers weren't a basic strength quirk. He got his powers from the being he had spawned. He was an idiot for not realizing that sooner. No matter how hard he pushed his body, he wasn't going to increase his actual strength that way. That wasn't how his powers worked. The real problem was that he hadn't been able to find any other way to boost his strength. His quirk, for his part, had grown more docile as of late. The actual emotions he sent into his mind had become much stronger, but the times he actually did had decreased to the point he could go days without feeling it. He didn't understand it at all. If there was one true failure on his part, it was the fact he hadn't been able to figure out anything with the quirk himself. He had not been able to find a way to communicate with it, which was really bad. Right now though, he didn't think about any of that. He just did a regular day of training. He justified it as keeping himself in shape until the entrance exams came, but the truth was that he didn't know what else to do. So he trained, fine-tuning his control as best he could. Like with the old forest, Izuku had learned a lot about this place in his time here. He had learned the hills, the ravines, the rivers. He'd meet 4 bears in this place, none of whom he had had any problems outrunning, or see coming thanks to his quirk. He'd also seen various oddities. People who had used their quirks to carve stuff into the rock, an old crashed plane overgrown with plant life, and a field that was strangely kept well cut at all times, and had a road leading to it. Of these oddities, Izuku had wondered the least about the field with the trimmed grass. Mayhaps because it was the most mundane of the mysteries, he had just ignored it and assumed someone just kept it well trimmed to use it for something. He wasn't far off with that assumption. It was as he was running past the small field, that someone teleported right into the middle of it. Izuku froze and just stared at the person, a woman with long hair and upraised arms, her hands glowing with a purple light. Izuku stared at her, the woman's back towards him as she muttered something he couldn't hear. His eyes went down to her waist, where she had a holstered gun in her belt. Danger. He didn't need to feel his quirk scream the feelings of absolute danger and vulnerability into his mind, but it certainly didn't hurt in regard to him making his next decision. As he threw himself behind a tree, the last thing he saw of the field was several other people materializing from nothing in flashes of purple energy. As he clung himself up against the wood, making sure no part of him stuck out, he began to breathe heavily, before forcing a hand over his mouth. He didn't know who these people were, but carrying guns meant they were one of 2 broader categories. Either they were policemen or the National Defense Force. Or they were criminals. Which, given they had just teleported into a field with a quirk user, was a pretty sure bet. Either way, he did not want to be discovered by them. "They're late." An annoyed tone, deep and loud, spoke in English. Izuku wasn't well enough versed in the various forms of English to recognize the accent, but he had watched enough English movies to know it wasn't from the USA or England. Yeah, we know, boss. This asshole's almost never at time." This voice was way less deep, though it had the same unknown accent. "Well, you guys know the drill." To his horror, Izuku began to hear footsteps as the men began to walk around, and at least one guy was heading in his direction. Panic, sheer panic, gripped him for a moment. He had to run, to bolt, to move. If he stayed here, he'd be discovered. His quirk, suddenly and without warning, slid out from his shirt and began to quickly cover his entire body. What the hell was it doing now? This time, somehow the black liquid did not actually hinder his sight. In fact, his eyes felt, well, weird was the best way to put it. Still, this new shock did nothing to dampen his fears. At least not until he saw that the liquid began to turn him transparent. Because that was a thing it could do. What? As a man with a drawn gun walked past him, looking from left to right behind the trees, he did not see the now transparent Izuku and just kept moving on. Izuku began to breathe again. As he held his hand up in front of his face, he saw that he wasn't truly invisible. The vague outline of his hand was still there, and it was really easy to see it as he moved. When he didn't move, however, it was really hard to see it. "All clear, here." The man who passed him yelled out before going back towards the field. To Izuku's dismay, he chose to stand right between his tree and the one to its side. He didn't look in Izuku's direction, though. Instead, he just looked out into the forest with a bored expression. The man was clearly not taking this seriously. Izuku, however, took the gun in his hand very, very seriously. The man was clearly American or European, with tanned skin and a shaved head. He wore a fine black business suit, though rather than fine shoes, he instead wore military boots. Freaking cold. He swore as he clearly visibly shivered. The man took out a cigarette from a sleeve and lit it up with a flame from his finger. So, a fire quirk. Usually, Izuku would have speculated about what he could do, but at the moment, the only thing he could focus on was keeping his breathing quiet and praying to any deity that existed for this guy not to discover him. And so it went for 20 minutes. Izuku clung up against a tree, praying not to be discovered, and the men around all finished their search and took up positions. The men were clearly waiting for someone. Izuku could hear clear swearing about the guy who was late, and how cold it was. These men hated the cold. Finally, the sound of a car driving up the road. The man by his tree tensed up, and turned to look into the field, and not into the woods. If Izuku had been more confident, this would have been the moment to slowly and carefully begin to walk away from the area. This was the first time in his life the boy had faced mortal danger, however. Not too surprisingly, he made the choice to stay put and desperately just waited out and hope he wasn't noticed before they left. He could hear the sound of a car stopping and people stepping out. "Well, you took your sweet-ass time getting here." Things came up. "Anyhow, you got the goods?" "Sure, 4 times the usual amount of trigger." "Drug dealers." These were drug dealers. At that moment, Izuku realized that everything that made this place so great for his training also made it great for criminal meetings. It was isolated, far from any city, and if something happened, no hero was going to show up. If he was discovered, he'd have to either escape on his own, or he would die. Even if he did call the police, there was no way in hell anyone would get here in time. There was the sound of some walking and rummaging around. "Yeah, this is trigger all right. And 4 times the regular amount. As we agreed. Now. The file." Some other sounds Izuku couldn't make out the origin of. "Are you sure you don't need help from us? We could help you out with the kidnapping, you know." "Kidnapping?" Who? He kinda hoped the man would say the unfortunate victim's name, but he didn't. We require no further assistance from your king of evil. We are here to recover one of our own. No more, no less. If you say so, still I think. The sound of Izuku's phone went off. Someone had chosen this moment to call him. Either his mom or one of their family friends. For Izuku, the world froze. He could feel it as every single person there turned around to look towards the source of the sound. The only man Izuku could see, the man between the trees, was staring dumbfoundedly at the source, clearly hearing it from Izuku's pocket, yet not seeing anything. He hesitated for a moment. That hesitation saved Izuku's life. It was time to go. Izuku sprang in a jump, away from the tree. As he landed, the spot he had just been hiding at exploded into fire. He didn't turn around to look through. Instead, he began running. Running as fast as he had ever run in his entire life. He didn't understand the mechanics behind it, but as he began running, he saw the transparency violently fade, and the black liquid retreated to his jacket. No time to think about that. Run. The bullets began to fly. A slender tree at his side splintered from a gunshot, ripping it in half. Something whizzed right over his head. His arm exploded in pain. Izuku screamed, but he did not stop running. If he stopped running, he died. Instead, he changed course to the left. Towards a ravine. Could they jump it? He could. He hoped. If they couldn't jump it, they were screwed with no way to cross other than the bridge 7 kilometers downstream. The ravine was maybe 1 meter wider than the one back in the old forest, but it was much deeper and steeper. You couldn't just climb up from it if you fell down. It was one of the reasons he had avoided it completely. As he ran, he kept hearing the sounds of gunshots and other sounds of fire, but they fell further and further behind. The bullets stopped almost hitting him, thank God. He ran for several minutes before the sight came. A ravine, dividing the west and east of this forest. He sprang, but he didn't spring to the very edge. Instead, he crouched down a meter from the edge, then sprang. It was close. Damned close. He hit the edge, and as he feared it would, it crumbled beneath him. However, expecting this, he threw himself forward, managing to grab onto a tree root. He gripped it tightly, then climbed up the tree before stepping down onto the ground. A gun barrel materialized in front of his face, in a flash of purple light, along with the woman holding it. He saw the motion of her fingers as she was pulling the trigger. He wrenched his head to the right and felt his left ear explode in pain as the gunpowder burst aflame in the barrel and sent the bullet flying right by his ear, missing it with only 3 centimeters. His left hand closed around the barrel and crushed it in his grip. He wrenched the thing from her grip, eliciting a groan of pain from the woman. He thought he might have broken one of her fingers. Rage flowed through his mind. He socked her straight in the face. The woman almost fell over the edge, but his hand grasped her around the wrist and he flung her onto safer ground. His breath came out in pained hisses, as he held an awkward combat stance, expecting her to get back up. She didn't. He stared at her for a moment, then hurriedly went over to her to check in on her. Had he killed her? As he knelt over her, his fear abated. No, she was alive, just unconscious. And with broken fingers. He jumped back as her phone began to ring. For a brief moment he just stared at it, then he made a decision. He hastily pulled out her phone from her pocket. As he fumbled, he realized he had trouble moving his right hand. Strange. He had been able to form a fist seconds ago. Why did it feel so weird? The arm was covered in the black substance of his quirk, as well as blood. Don't think about it. He took the phone, and then as he began to run again, he declined the caller, a guy called Hammerhead, and instead called up the police. Hello, this is the police. A polite tone answered. Hi, I'm calling about a meeting between drug dealers in Ashura Forest. The policeman tried to speak, but Izuku just continued. They are dealing with Trigger, and they are planning to kidnap someone. I don't know who. Who is this? The policeman asked in a confused tone. Izuku didn't answer. Instead, he just kept talking. They are west of the big ravine splitting the forest Indiana too. Except for one, she's currently unconscious on the east side, but she's a teleporter, so when she wakes back up again, she'll just teleport everyone away. One of the groups has a car, but I don't think everyone can fit in it. If you go now, you can probably catch everyone. Who dash? Izuku hung up, then, fumbling out his own phone, he checked the map, making sure he was going the right way, and he kept on running home. It took him 5 hours to run the entire way home, his adrenaline keeping him going the entire way without any stops. The closest thing to a stop he made was to slow down to send a message to David not to come to pick him up. And that he'd get home himself. He hoped to God David listened to him. This time, as he ran through the streets, he hadn't cared if anyone saw him as he ran through the city. Thankfully, when he finally reached Mustafa, night had fallen, so not many were out in the street. He kept going all the way until he reached his own home, opened the door, and collapsed on the floor of the entrance. As the pain sank into his burning lungs, and his eyes began to swim, Izuku noticed his mom wasn't home. That meant she wasn't here to see him in pain for the next half hour as his lungs burned, his arm was still in horrible pain from having a hole shot in it, and his ear hurt as much as his foot had. As he lay on the floor, the black mass, his other half, gently closed around his ear. The pain in the arm did not abate, but thankfully, his ear felt like a calming, soothing liquid entered into it, dulling the pain. Which was pretty much what happened. After his lungs stopped feeling like they had been poked with hot iron rods, he sat up. At that moment, the only thing he wanted to do was lie down. Sleep. He almost let it happen, but he forced himself to stay awake, as he got back up onto his feet and into the living room. He sat down on the TV and flipped through news channels. He was still watching the news with a tired and drained expression. Eventually, he did pull out his phone. It felt like lead, though whether he was tired, or just afraid to call his mom, he didn't know. Either way, he took a deep breath, then clicked the green button. He'd promised he'd do that after all. Through his mind, his quirk sent only one emotion. The same it had been sending for hours now. Satisfaction. It was agreed between both the younger and older Midoriya, that Izuku would not train anymore until the exam day came around. Izuku was fine with that. The reality was that he hadn't actually gotten more out of it for a while now. He had mastered control, and his strength wasn't growing no matter how much he trained. It made logical sense to just lay low and keep calm, and take some time off to lessen the stress. Unfortunately, if there was one thing Izuku was not getting less of at the moment, it was stress. Unsurprisingly, the aftermath of almost getting killed was the most stressful thing Izuku had ever experienced in his life. But it would have been one thing if that had been the end of it. It wasn't. At all. On the plus side, the police and heroes had successfully captured both groups, at least according to the news. The bad part came in that apparently one of the criminals had escaped police capture. He did not need to be an unprecedented genius to guess which one it had been. It had been the one who could teleport. The only one he was sure could identify him. It had led to some really stressful final days of middle school, as he was terrified she would suddenly appear out of nowhere to take revenge on him. It hadn't happened, of course. There were tens of thousands of people in this province alone who fit the criteria of a male teenager with green hair. Add the 2 neighboring provinces, and that number might reach near 100,000. There was no way in hell she was going to be able to find him. It still didn't make Izuku feel better. There was a distinct difference between knowing something and accepting it to be true. Then there was the whole not telling the police about it. The anonymous tipper had been mentioned on TV, of course, but Izuku had made the choice in the woods not to identify himself, terrified he'd be punished for using his quirk, both for training and for escape. His mother had completely agreed with that choice. Hell, when she learned the phone they had taken had been encrusted with Izuku's blood, she had smashed it herself. She wasn't taking chances that he could ever be discovered in relation to this. By her own explanation, while a normal person might get a slap on the wrist for using their quirk like that, a prospective hero would not. Even if it didn't tank his prospects of getting into a hero school, it would still be a really black mark on his career that would cause him major problems down the line. The state did not tolerate people who used their quirks on others without permission. The whole conversation had kinda made Izuku rethink his view on the strictness of limitations on quirk usage. He had always thought it made perfect sense that only trained heroes could legally use their quirks. The realization anyone who used their quirk to save their own life would likely be punished was kinda asinine in his opinion. His mother had agreed when he had voiced that opinion but had begged him not to say that to anyone else. It wasn't an opinion that would be well received in the hero world. She hadn't been wrong. He had looked up the topic, and it was complicated. Basically, the debate on the topic went all the way back to the infamous Destro, one of the most famous Japanese villains in history. A man only overshadowed by the legendary All for One, the shadowy figure who had ruled the Japanese underworld in the wake of the societal collapse that came about when quirks emerged. It was an incredibly charged topic, and every single hero who had tried to change it had had their careers go down the drain. Either way, a deep debate about philosophy wasn't something he had time for now. 2 days left before the exam that all his efforts, his studying, his mistakes, and successes had all been leading towards. God, he was tense. Nothing he did seemed to be calming him down. Not doing research on heroes, not watching videos of heroes, and not even watching videos of All Might managed to calm him down. And on top of it all, his quirk had become completely silent over the last week. He didn't even go and watch the TV anymore. Instead, all he did was jump into whatever shirt Izuku was wearing, and if he didn't wear a shirt, well, it had gotten very awkward. Despite all his tenseness, though, when it came time to sleeping that night, Izuku Midoriya fell asleep astonishingly quickly. Unnaturally so. It didn't take more than 7 minutes between when his head touched his pillow, and his hands dropped his phone. He was out like a turned-off light. A black liquid oozed out of his nightshirt and began to slowly, methodically, and with great care envelop the body of Izuku Midoriya. It was time. From Izuku's bed rose a figure of complete darkness, like it was clad in shadows. 2 eyes opened in the figure's skull. Large, and white, and glimmering in the light from the moon outside. The figure rose from the bed on steady feet, then it went to the window and opened it. Not heeding the fact that they were 5 stories up, the figure climbed out through the open window. It had a destination in mind. One it had picked out months ago. Izuku walked down a road by a city neighborhood. At first, he wasn't sure where it was exactly, but he had eventually come to realize where he was. This was a place from his childhood. His old neighborhood, the place where Katsuki still lived. It was almost just like Izuku remembered it. The houses, the street signs, the roads. They were all like Izuku had once remembered them. As he walked, he passed by Tsubasa's house, a kid he and Katsuki had once hung out with. The door was locked though. He could not enter the yard. You met this one first. Before the Katsuki. Yeah, that was right. He remembered now. The winged boy was the first friend he made back in kindergarten. He had thought the boy was so cool with his red wings. A false friend. The first one. But not the last. It was through Tsubasa that he had met Katsuki and Sai. In a way, it had been Tsubasa who had led him and Katsuki together. As he walked, he came to an opening to a playground. 5 kids were inside. Katsuki, Sai, Tsubasa, Izuku, and another boy named Minato. Izuku remembered this scene. He had lived through this moment long ago. Minato was on his knees cradling his arm and crying. Katsuki had hurt him, just like he would hurt Izuku moments later. Izuku was standing between Minato and Katsuki along with the other 2 of their friends. He was crying. He knew what was coming. Izuku tried to stop what was going to happen here, but as his hand closed around one of the younger Katsuki's arms, the figure burst into black liquid. Everything else did as well: Izuku, the other boy, the playground, the sky itself. Everything burst into blackness. Everything except Izuku himself. Izuku stood in a gray void, a web of white formed beneath his feet, serving as his floor in this place. Despite the darkness, Izuku could see that there was a light here, lightening the grayness wherever he looked, like he had a lamp over his shoulder. Whenever he turned to try and find the source of the light, it eluded him. As he looked out into the void, he realized he was wrong. He wasn't the only thing here. Off into the distance, there were webs. Enormous black webs, like that of some humongous spider. They were all around. As Izuku looked at them, his breath having caught in his throat, a set of large white eyes appeared in the air. The darkness fell where they were, so heavy that not even the light that followed his eyes could penetrate it. A spotlight appeared to Izuku's left. The spotlight showed the aftermath of the scene that had just disintegrated. Izuku lying on the ground, bruised and battered. Minato tearfully trying to help him up. As younger Izuku was about to actually get up, the spotlight vanished and the scene with it. What happened to Minato? The voice asked, sounding generally curious. He never played with us again. I think his mom eventually transferred him to another school. Wise woman. Why did this happen? The sound of the voice made it clear it wasn't seeking the actual answer. It wanted to know if Izuku knew. Because Katsuki is a terrible person who likes beating those weaker than him. That seemed obvious now, detached from sentiments regarding Katsuki. This was who he had always been. Wasn't it? No. That isn't the reason at all. But what you just described was the motivation for one of the main players in this little drama. But he wasn't the only player here. There were Tsubasa and Sai, who could both have decided not to follow Katsuki's lead. But there was also you. You chose to defend him. Yet the outcome did not change, other than you suffering as Minato did. More, in fact. Why? Why? Why had he been beaten up every time he actually tried to stand up to Katsuki? Because he had powers, and I didn't. Exactly. That is the crust of the matter. Power. It comes in many flavors, direct, soft, political, personal. You know one such flavor. Quirks. You wanted one. So desperately. Another spotlight, this time showing one of Izuku's many attempts to breathe fire, or use telekinesis. As it went out, another came in a different spot, this time showing him trying to discover other powers. It went out, and another came in its place. Such persistence. It worked, didn't it? In the sense that you eventually gained powers, yes. The spotlight went out again. Then the void disintegrated into dust, and the dust flew all around, as it formed another scene. This time a forest, a ravine. Below them, Izuku was lying in the water with a broken foot. You had powers here, yet you failed. You miscalculated, and you misjudged. You lacked experience, knowledge, guidance. Yeah, but Stick-san helped me. He gave me advice and guidance. The hero in red appeared on the other side of the ravine. Yes, the voice said in grudging agreement. But he was only there once, was he not? You never met him again. However valuable his advice might have been, he was not there for you. During your final training. The scene once again disintegrated. This time it reformed as another forest, a much more wild one. With a plain. Izuku went cold, as the men appeared out of the dust. The gunman. Stick was not there for you during your first skirmish, was he? Did he hide you from their sight? Did he grant you strength when you needed it? Did he close the wound and stop you from bleeding too? Death? He understood who this was now. This isn't a dream, is it? This is your soul, Izuku Midoriya. Your essence, your mind. Whatever you wish to call it. As Izuku stared at the darkness, he heard the sound of his phone. Once again, the other leaped from his hiding spot, an explosion of flame engulfing where he had been. As first skirmishes go, this wasn't too bad. You estimated your capacity and limitations well and made a rather remarkable retreat given your limitations. Hell, you even managed to call upon the protectors of law and order. That was a pretty fancy way of saying he had run away like a coward. You wish you didn't need to run, do you not, Izuku? Yeah. You wish you had more power, do you not, Izuku Midoriya? What you have is not enough for you. Not enough at all. Izuku stared at him. Getting stronger was literally what he had been trying to do for months. He had tried so hard to find some way to talk to his quirk. To do what he was doing now. I want to get stronger, he finally said. So, you are willing to finish it? The world was destroyed again, this time as if it were made of glass that suddenly shattered. Once again he was in the void. But this time, beneath him, he saw a symbol. A giant white spider, surrounded by black tar. Finish. Finish what? Our bond, Izuku Midoriya. It is nearing completion, the point of. No. Return. Izuku watched as the liquid beneath the web he was standing on began to turn and trash, like a sea during a storm. The white spider began to sink beneath the waves. Izuku felt it down to his core. Something was about to happen. Something that could not be undone. In one moment, he saw how fragile it actually was. He could break it. He could stop this. He was in control here, not the other one. All he had to do was force this to stop, and the bond would break. We will be one, Izuku. Together, we can do it all, whatever your dreams desire. We see. Izuku jumped from the web before it was done speaking. Why would he ever want to break this bond? This bond was his future, his life, his dreams. It was the thing that had changed his life around when everything had seemed like it was all doomed to eternal disappointment. It was salvation. It was all he ever wanted. He crashed into the black liquid, which embraced him like he was a long-lost lover that had finally come home again after countless years apart. The white spider rose up to meet him. On the top floor of a skyscraper, in a room that had been abandoned for years, a figure seemingly made of living darkness entered from the rooftop in the middle of the night. It was an old skyscraper, used by a bunch of different sales companies. The top floors, however, hadn't been in use since a hero who had made it his home had retired years ago. The figure entered a storage room, then it climbed up into a corner of the room, where it began to encase itself in a cocoon of black webs. The hours went by. 1.00, 2.00, 4.00. At 5:43, the web, which had been still for hours, began to move. At 5:56, the webs began to break. On 6.12, the cocoon began to crack. Finally, at 6.27, an arm burst out of the black cocoon. The arm was a shade of blue so dark it seemed black, even in the sunlight coming in from the windows. Another arm burst out from the container and wrenched it open as a figure came out into the morning light. The cocoon began to fall apart, and then each of the black pieces began to seemingly disintegrate into nothing. The figure was of the same ethereal blue that bordered on black. The way the light revealed it seemed completely unnatural for anything on Earth. It was alien. In every way imaginable. On its chest was a symbol, showcasing a giant white spider, whose legs went around and linked it to an identical spider on the back. On the back of his hands were two white square patches, slightly higher than the skin around them. On his head, which was like a sleek, smooth mannequin, were two large, pure white eyes, like patches. Holy shit! Izuku felt alive. More alive than he had ever felt in his life. He felt strong. He felt like he had become a creature of steel, every sinew alive with power. He flexed his arm, and he noticed the complete change in his muscles. Hell, his quirk even parted to let him get a better look at the skin. The arm that had been scrawny was now replaced with ripped muscles, the outline from the scar that the bullet had left being the only thing that marred it. It was an unusual scar, with the circle around it being how a scar usually looked, while the inside had completely perfect skin. Izuku did not focus on his unusual scar, however. He was far too busy marveling at the changes. He felt amazing. He felt incredible. He felt like he could jump through the air like he was All Might himself. He could do it. He could. Flashes of memories began to flood his mind. Memories of things that couldn't be, impossible things, things that completely upended everything he had ever thought he knew about the universe. Izuku froze completely. He just stood there gaping, trying desperately to process it all, until finally the thing detached itself from his head and formed a face in front of him. This face did not much resemble the struggling mass he had come to know and accept as his quirk. This one was solid, with no drops of black liquid almost falling from it. It also had large, sharp white eyes, and a smile of creepy sharp fangs. "Hello, Izuku." The voice was like Izuku's, just deeper and without any of the reservation Izuku carried with him. Izuku just stared at that face, not in fear, as was probably how he should have felt. No, he felt only complete and utter shock. You're not a quirk, are you? The thing. No, the alien laughed. Not by any stretch, no. My name, Izuku, is Venom. We are not from around here, so to say. You're an alien. Guilty as charged. We are what the universe know as a Clintar, though you would translate it as dash. Symbiote, Izuku said numbly. Yes, Venom answered cheerfully. Reality set in for Izuku. His quirk was an alien. A goddamned being from outer space. He slumped up against the wall and sank against it until he sat. And he had bonded with it. Permanently. You know, Izuku, nothing has really changed in the grand scheme of things. Everything has changed. He didn't mean to scream. It just came out like that. He cradled his head as he began hyperventilating. I thought I was normal. I thought I was finally like everyone else. Instead, I'm... What? What was he exactly? Not normal, that was for damned sure. Normal is overrated. What you want is to be extraordinary, is it not? You wanted power, and we are providing it for you. This is what you always wanted, isn't it? To be strong? It was. The truth of that statement burned. He had wanted powers for so many years that when he finally got them, he didn't even question that it might not be a quirk, even though he really should have. He had been told long ago that it was physically impossible for him to have a quirk. And the doctor had been right. Completely, utterly right. Look, Izuku, it doesn't matter where your powers come from. The end result is the same. What, you mean I should just pretend you're a quirk? As opposed to what exactly? Tell everyone that you're bonded to an alien? We've been in quite a few first contacts, Izuku, and there are only two ways that roads end. Either you're labeled a madman, or you're believed, and you're hunted by the local government for the rest of your life. Izuku froze. He hadn't even considered that. Oh, God. He was right. He couldn't tell anyone about this. Ever. It was amazing how this night had washed away all his previous stress, only to replace it with way more stressful issues.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.